The Great Crusade had ended in betrayal and civil war, leaving the Imperium scarred and forever changed. As the smoke cleared from the final battles of the Horus Heresy, the surviving loyalist forces faced a monumental task of reorganization. The Emperor, now entombed upon the Golden Throne, could no longer guide his legions directly, and the massive formations that had conquered the galaxy in his name had proven vulnerable to corruption and treachery. It was in this crucible of necessity that the second founding was born in the early 31st millennium. Robute Guilliman, primarch of the Ultramarines and one of the few surviving loyal sons of the Emperor, had spent the closing years of the heresy formulating what would become known as the Codex Astartes. This comprehensive tome laid out new organizational structures, tactical doctrines, and most importantly, the division of the existing Space Marine legions into smaller, more manageable chapters. The logic was sound. Never again would a single commander wield the power of an entire legion, and the risk of wholesale corruption would be significantly reduced. The Blood Angels Legion, having suffered devastating losses during the Siege of Terra and the death of their beloved primarch Sanguinius, faced this reorganization with particular complexity. The Sons of the Angel had fought with unmatched valor throughout the heresy, but they carried within their gene seed a dark inheritance that would shape their successors for millennia to come. The Red Thirst, a genetic flaw that drove battle brothers to seek blood in close combat with an almost vampiric hunger, had manifested sporadically throughout the Legion's history. More troubling still were the first recorded instances of what would later be known as the Black Rage, a condition where warriors would become lost in visions of their primarch's final moments, believing themselves to be Sanguinius himself in his death throes. Commander Azkalan, who had served as Sanguinius's Sanguinary Guard captain, worked closely with the remaining Blood Angels command structure to implement the division. The Legion's gene seed would give rise to several successor chapters, each inheriting both the nobility and the curse of their lineage. Among these new chapters, one would stand apart for the ferocity of its warriors and the particular manifestation of their genetic heritage, the Flesh Terrors. The selection of leadership for these new chapters required careful consideration. The Blood Angels had always been known for their dual nature, capable of the most refined artistry and culture, yet possessed of a savage hunger for battle that could border on the bestial. Each company within the original Legion had developed its own character and traditions, and it was from these existing formations that the new chapter masters would be chosen. Captain Nasir Amit of the 5th Company had earned a fearsome reputation throughout the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. Where other Blood Angels sought to suppress or channel their more violent impulses, Amit had embraced them as tools of war. His company had become known for their brutal efficiency in close combat, often continuing to fight long after their enemies had been defeated, tearing apart corpses in a frenzy that disturbed even their battle brothers. This behavior had earned Amit the epithet Flesh Terror, a name that spoke to both his tactical preferences and the savage nature of his warriors. During the Great Crusade, Amit's 5th Company had been deployed to some of the most challenging compliance actions, where their particular brand of warfare proved devastatingly effective. On the world of Kavas, they had broken a rebellion by systematically hunting down the insurgent leaders through the Underhive, leaving behind scenes of carnage that served as warnings to other potential rebels. The Kavas' suppression had lasted only 3 days, but the memories of Amit's warriors emerging from the darkness, their armor painted with the blood of their enemies, had become legend among the Imperial Army regiments that witnessed it. The heresy had provided even more opportunities for Amit to demonstrate his company's capabilities. At the Battle of Cygnus Prime, when the Blood Angels faced the demonic forces of the Ruinous Powers, the 5th Company had fought with such intensity that even the bloodthirster Kabandha had taken notice of their savagery. While other companies struggled with the psychic assault that drove many of their brothers into madness, Amit's warriors seemed to find strength in their rage, channeling it into devastating attacks that carved through demon flesh with mechanical precision. The defense of Terra had seen the 5th Company positioned along the Eternity Wall, where they faced wave after wave of traitor forces. Amit himself had led 17 separate counterattacks, each one driving deeper into enemy lines until his warriors were fighting hand to hand in the rubble of collapsed fortifications. When the siege finally ended, the 5th Company had suffered 60% casualties, but they had held their section of the wall without yielding a single meter of ground. It was this record of unwavering loyalty and brutal effectiveness that brought Amit to the attention of the Reorganization Committee. While some questioned whether his methods were too extreme, none could argue with their results. The Flesh Terrors, as they would come to be known, needed a leader who understood the darker aspects of the Blood Angels' nature and could forge them into a weapon worthy of the Emperor's service. The genetic legacy that the Flesh Terrors inherited from Sanguinius was both blessing and curse. The gene seed of the Blood Angels had always been among the most stable and pure of all the legions, producing warriors of exceptional strength, speed, and longevity. The sons of Sanguinius possessed enhanced senses that bordered on the supernatural, able to track enemies by scent alone and detect the slightest movement in complete darkness. Their reflexes were faster than those of most other space marines, and their natural grace in combat was unmatched. However, the red thirst that accompanied these gifts manifested more strongly in Amit's warriors than in their parent legion. Where other Blood Angels might experience occasional urges for blood and violence, the Flesh Terrors found themselves constantly battling against an almost overwhelming hunger. This condition affected not just their behavior in combat, but their daily existence within the chapter. Battle Brothers would spend hours in meditation, trying to center themselves and maintain control over their baser impulses. The chapter's chaplains developed specialized rituals and practices designed to channel this aggression constructively, but the struggle remained constant. The manifestation of the red thirst among the Flesh Terrors took several distinct forms. Some warriors experienced it as a literal hunger for blood, requiring them to consume the vital fluid of their enemies to achieve any sense of satisfaction. Others found themselves driven to ever greater acts of violence, unable to stop fighting until their enemies were not merely defeated but utterly destroyed. The most severely affected would enter a state similar to the Black Rage, but instead of reliving Sanguinius's death, they would become lost in visions of endless slaughter, seeing enemies everywhere and attacking anything that moved. These genetic quirks necessitated careful management of the chapter's recruitment and training processes. The Flesh Terrors could not simply follow the standard Codex Astartes procedures for creating new space marines. Instead, they had to develop their own methods for identifying candidates who possessed both the mental fortitude to resist the red thirst and the physical capability to channel it effectively. This process began with the selection of their homeworld, a decision that would prove crucial to the chapter's future development. Cretacia, a death world located in the Segmentum Solar, presented the ideal environment for recruiting the kind of warriors the Flesh Terrors required. The planet's surface was dominated by vast jungles filled with predatory creatures that had evolved to hunt in packs. The human population existed in a state of constant warfare, not just against the planet's fauna, but against each other, as different tribes competed for the limited resources available in the few habitable zones. The tribal societies of Cretacia had developed a culture that valued strength, cunning, and the ability to kill without hesitation. Young warriors proved themselves by hunting the planet's most dangerous predators, often using nothing more than crude weapons and their own physical prowess. The successful hunters were marked with ritual scars and tattoos that told the story of their kills, creating a permanent record of their achievements. This tradition of marking the flesh would later influence the chapter's own practices, as Battle Brothers began incorporating similar scarification into their initiation rituals. The recruitment process established by the Flesh Terrors on Cretacia differed significantly from that of other chapters. Rather than simply selecting the strongest or most skilled candidates, the chapter's chaplains and apothecaries looked for specific psychological markers that indicated a candidate's ability to control violent impulses while still maintaining access to them when needed. They sought young warriors who had demonstrated the capacity for both savage brutality and disciplined restraint, often within the same engagement. The trials themselves were designed to test not just physical capability, but mental resilience. Candidates were exposed to controlled doses of stimulants that mimicked the effects of the red thirst, forcing them to maintain their sanity while experiencing overwhelming urges toward violence. Those who succeeded in these trials demonstrated the kind of mental fortitude that would serve them well as full battle brothers. Those who failed were either killed by their own actions or suffered permanent psychological damage that rendered them unsuitable for further consideration. The chapter's early recruitment practices also incorporated elements of Cretacean tribal culture that proved surprisingly compatible with Space Marine traditions. The planet's warriors had long practiced ritual combat as a means of settling disputes and establishing hierarchy, and these customs were adapted into the chapter's training regimens. New recruits would face each other in carefully controlled duels that tested their ability to fight with controlled aggression, learning to channel their violent impulses into precise, devastating attacks rather than wild, undisciplined fury. The establishment of the chapter's fortress monastery on Cretaceous required extensive modification of the planet's existing infrastructure. The chosen site was located atop a massive plateau that rose from the jungle canopy, providing both defensive advantages and symbolic significance. The structure itself was built to accommodate the chapter's specific needs, including specialized chambers for meditation and bloodletting rituals, as well as extensive medical facilities for monitoring and treating the various manifestations of the red thirst. The fortress monastery's design incorporated elements of both imperial architecture and Cretacean tribal aesthetics. The walls were decorated with carved reliefs depicting scenes of battle and hunt, while the interior spaces featured collections of weapons and trophies taken from defeated enemies. The chapter's librarium contained not just tactical manuals and historical records, but also detailed studies of the red thirst and its effects, as the flesh terrors sought to understand and master their genetic heritage rather than simply endure it. As the chapter began to take shape, its early campaigns demonstrated both the potential and the challenges inherent in their nature. The flesh terrors proved devastatingly effective against enemies that required close-quarters combat, their enhanced aggression and resistance to fear making them ideal for boarding actions and urban warfare. However, their tendency toward excessive violence sometimes created diplomatic complications, as imperial commanders struggled to explain the aftermath of flesh terror's operations to local populations and allied forces. The chapter's first major engagement came during the Cretacean Rebellion, when several of the planet's larger tribes attempted to overthrow imperial rule. The flesh terrors found themselves in the unusual position of fighting against the same kind of warriors they recruited from, creating a complex dynamic that tested their loyalty and discipline. The campaign lasted 6 months and resulted in the complete pacification of the rebellious tribes, but the methods employed by the chapter generated significant controversy within imperial command circles. The genetic legacy inherited by the flesh terrors from their primarch Sanguinius carried within it a darkness that would define the chapter's existence for millennia to come. While all sons of the angel bore the mark of their father's sacrifice, the flesh terrors found themselves afflicted with manifestations of the red thirst that exceeded even the most severe cases documented among their parent legion. This condition, which had appeared sporadically throughout the Blood Angels' history, became a constant companion to Nasir Amit's warriors, shaping not only their combat doctrine, but their very identity as a chapter. The red thirst manifested in the flesh terrors through a complex interplay of genetic predisposition and psychological conditioning that began during their recruitment from Cretaceous tribal populations. Unlike other Blood Angels' successors, where the condition might emerge gradually over decades or centuries of service, the flesh terrors experienced its onset much earlier in their development. Neophytes undergoing the implantation process would often display symptoms before their gene seed had fully matured, experiencing intense cravings for blood and raw flesh that required constant supervision from the chapter's apothecaries. The physical symptoms of the red thirst among the flesh terrors were both more pronounced and more varied than those observed in other chapters. Battle brothers would develop an enhanced sense of smell that allowed them to detect the scent of blood from incredible distances, sometimes becoming agitated or aggressive when exposed to even trace amounts. Their canine teeth would elongate and sharpen beyond the normal modifications produced by Space Marine gene seed, creating fangs that were both functional and symbolic of their condition. The skin around their eyes would darken and become more sensitive to light, giving them an almost vampiric appearance that many found deeply unsettling. More troubling were the behavioral changes that accompanied these physical transformations. Warriors afflicted with severe cases of the Red Thirst would experience what the chapter's chaplains termed blood dreams, vivid hallucinations where they relived moments of extreme violence from their past battles. These visions would often blur the line between memory and fantasy, causing battle brothers to act out scenes of carnage while believing themselves to be in the midst of combat. The chapter's fortress monastery on Cretaceous contained specialized chambers where affected warriors could be safely restrained during these episodes, their walls scarred by countless claw marks and impact craters from centuries of violent outbursts. The triggers for Red Thirst episodes among the Flesh Terrors were both more numerous and more sensitive than those affecting other Blood Angels' successors. The scent of blood, whether from enemies or allies, could send a warrior into a feeding frenzy that required immediate intervention from his squad mates. The sound of screaming or the sight of open wounds could provoke similar reactions, making the chapter's warriors particularly dangerous in medical facilities or during rescue operations. Even the consumption of standard Space Marine rations could trigger episodes in severely affected individuals, as the processed nutrients failed to satisfy their enhanced metabolic requirements. The chapter's apothecaries developed elaborate protocols for managing these triggers during combat operations. Battle Brothers were organized into squads based on the severity of their condition, with the most affected warriors placed under the direct supervision of sergeants who had demonstrated exceptional self-control. Special combat stimulants were distributed before engagements, designed to channel the Red Thirst into focused aggression rather than uncontrolled violence. These chemical cocktails required precise dosing, as too little would fail to contain the condition, while too much could push warriors into a state indistinguishable from the Black Rage. The relationship between the Red Thirst and combat effectiveness proved complex and often contradictory. Warriors in the grip of the condition displayed enhanced strength and speed that exceeded normal Space Marine capabilities, their bodies flooding with adrenaline and other combat hormones that pushed them beyond their usual limitations. Their pain tolerance increased dramatically, allowing them to continue fighting despite injuries that would incapacitate other warriors. However, this enhanced performance came at the cost of tactical awareness and unit cohesion, as affected battle brothers would often break formation to pursue individual targets or continue attacking enemies long after they had been neutralized. The Black Rage represented an even more severe manifestation of the genetic curse that plagued the Flesh Terrors. This condition, which caused warriors to relive the final moments of Sanguinius during his battle with Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit, affected the chapter at a rate significantly higher than that observed among other Blood Angels' successors. Where the parent legion might see 1 or 2 cases per century, the Flesh Terrors experienced multiple episodes each decade, creating a constant drain on their already limited manpower. The onset of the Black Rage among the Flesh Terrors followed patterns that differed markedly from those documented in other chapters. Rather than occurring randomly or in response to specific traumatic events, the condition often manifested in clusters, with multiple battle brothers succumbing within days or weeks of each other. The chapter's librarians theorized that some form of psychic resonance existed between affected warriors, causing the condition to spread through squads and companies like a contagion. This clustering effect made it particularly dangerous during extended campaigns, where the loss of multiple warriors to the Black Rage could cripple entire tactical formations. The visions experienced by Flesh Terrors in the grip of the Black Rage were notably more violent and detailed than those reported by other chapters. Warriors would not simply relive Sanguinius's death, but would experience it from multiple perspectives, sometimes believing themselves to be the primarch, other times seeing themselves as Horus or even as the emperor himself. These shifting viewpoints created a disorienting experience that made affected battle brothers extremely unpredictable in their actions. They might attack allies they perceived as traitors, or attempt to protect enemies they believed to be loyal imperial forces. The chapter's Death Company protocols required significant modification to account for these unique manifestations of the Black Rage. Traditional Blood Angels practice involved isolating affected warriors and deploying them in suicidal charges against the enemy, allowing them to die with honor while serving the Emperor one final time. However, the Flesh Terrors found that their Death Company Marines often survived these supposedly final battles, their enhanced aggression and resistance to injury allowing them to carve through enemy formations that should have overwhelmed them. This survival rate created logistical and ethical challenges for the chapter's leadership. Death Company Marines who returned from battle remained trapped in their visions, unable to distinguish between past and present friend and foe. The chapter constructed specialized containment facilities within their fortress monastery, where these warriors could be housed safely, while the chaplains attempted various treatments. These chambers were built to withstand the incredible strength of Space Marines in the grip of the Black Rage, with reinforced walls and restraint systems that could hold even the most violent individuals. The chapter's chaplains developed unique rituals and practices designed to manage both the Red Thirst and the Black Rage. These ceremonies incorporated elements of Cretacean tribal culture, including ritual scarification and bloodletting, that provided temporary relief from the worst symptoms. The chaplains would lead affected warriors through elaborate reenactments of historical battles, allowing them to channel their violent impulses in controlled environments. These sessions often lasted for hours, with participants engaging in mock combat using blunted weapons until they collapsed from exhaustion. The genetic degradation affecting the Flesh Terror's gene seed became increasingly apparent as the millennia passed. Each successive generation of recruits displayed symptoms of the Red Thirst at younger ages and with greater severity than their predecessors. The chapter's apothecaries maintained detailed records of these changes, documenting the gradual deterioration of their genetic heritage with scientific precision. Their data showed a clear pattern of accelerating mutation, with the time between implantation and first symptoms decreasing by an average of 6 months per century. This degradation manifested in several distinct ways beyond the increased prevalence of the Red Thirst and Black Rage. The chapter's gene seed began producing warriors with enhanced physical capabilities that came at the cost of psychological stability. Battle Brothers displayed increased muscle mass and bone density, along with improved reflexes and sensory acuity, but these enhancements were accompanied by heightened aggression and reduced impulse control. The chapter's recruitment standards had to be constantly adjusted to account for these changes, with candidates requiring ever greater mental fortitude to successfully complete the transformation process. The mutation rate affecting the Flesh Terror's gene seed exceeded that of any other known Blood Angel's successor chapter. Apothecaries documented cases where the progenitor glands responsible for producing new gene seed had become so corrupted that they were unusable for creating new Space Marines. This genetic instability threatened the chapter's long-term survival, as each generation produced fewer viable candidates for recruitment. The chapter's leadership was forced to implement increasingly desperate measures to maintain their numbers, including the use of experimental gene therapy techniques that carried significant risks for both donors and recipients. The chapter's attempts at genetic stabilization began in earnest during the 32nd millennium, when the rate of gene seed degradation reached critical levels. The Flesh Terrors established secret research facilities on remote worlds throughout their domain, staffed by teams of apothecaries and tech adepts who worked tirelessly to understand and reverse the corruption affecting their genetic heritage. These laboratories were equipped with advanced gene sequencing equipment and biological processing units that allowed for detailed analysis of the mutation patterns. The research conducted by the Flesh Terrors pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable within the Imperium's strict guidelines regarding genetic manipulation. The The chapter's scientists experimented with viral vectors designed to repair damaged gene sequences, along with chemical treatments that could suppress the expression of corrupted traits. They studied samples from other Blood Angel successors, attempting to identify the specific factors that made the Flesh Terrors more susceptible to genetic degradation than their cousin chapters. One of the most promising avenues of research involved the study of Cretacean tribal genetics and their potential interaction with Space Marine gene seed. The chapter's apothecaries theorized that certain genetic markers present in the planet's population might be exacerbating the effects of the Red Thirst and Black Rage. They began screening potential recruits for these markers, implementing selective breeding programs designed to gradually reduce their prevalence in the population. These efforts required careful coordination with the planet's tribal leaders, who were told that the programs were designed to improve the overall health and fitness of their people. The chapter also pursued more radical approaches to genetic stabilization, including attempts to synthesize artificial gene seed using recovered samples from the original Blood Angels Legion. These experiments required access to genetic material that predated the corruption affecting the Flesh Terrors lineage, forcing the chapter to establish covert relationships with other imperial organizations that might possess such samples. The chapter's agents infiltrated Mechanicus research facilities and imperial archives, seeking any trace of uncorrupted Blood Angels genetic material that could serve as a template for their work. The secrecy surrounding these research efforts extended to the highest levels of the chapter's command structure. Only the chapter master, chief apothecary, and a select few other senior officers were aware of the full scope of the genetic stabilization programs. The chapter's battle brothers were told that the research facilities were conducting routine gene seed monitoring and quality control procedures, standard practice for any Space Marine chapter. This deception was necessary to prevent panic among the rank and file, who might lose faith in their genetic heritage if they knew the true extent of the corruption affecting their gene seed. The chapter's research efforts yielded mixed results over the centuries. Some experimental treatments showed promise in reducing the severity of red thirst symptoms, while others had no effect or even worsened the condition. The most successful interventions involved complex cocktails of genetic modifiers and neural suppressants that could delay the onset of the Black Rage by several decades. However, these treatments came with significant side effects, including reduced combat effectiveness and shortened lifespans for treated individuals. The Flesh Terrors' desperate search for a cure led them to explore increasingly dangerous avenues of research. They investigated reports of other chapters that had successfully overcome genetic curses, seeking to adapt their methods to their own situation. The chapter's librarians delved into forbidden texts and archaeotech databases, searching for any reference to genetic manipulation techniques that might prove useful. These investigations brought them into contact with knowledge that skirted the edges of heresy, forcing the chapter's leadership to carefully balance their desire for a cure against the risk of corruption. The chapter's relationship with the broader Imperium became increasingly strained as their genetic condition worsened. Imperial commanders began to question the reliability of Flesh Terrors' forces, particularly after several incidents where battle brothers had turned on allied troops during combat operations. The chapter found itself excluded from certain types of missions, particularly those involving civilian populations or cooperation with other Imperial forces. This isolation only reinforced the chapter's determination to find a solution to their genetic problems, as they recognized that their continued existence depended on proving their worth to the Imperium despite their flaws. The selection of Cretacia as the homeworld for the Flesh Terrors proved to be one of the most prescient decisions in the chapter's early history. This death world, located in the Segmentum Solar, within relatively close proximity to Terra, presented an environment that would perfectly complement the chapter's genetic predispositions and tactical requirements. The planet's surface was dominated by vast continental landmasses covered in dense, primordial jungles that had remained largely unchanged for millions of years. These forests stretched across roughly 70% of the planet's habitable surface, creating a green hell where only the strongest and most adaptable species could survive. The ecosystem of Cretaceous had evolved along distinctly predatory lines, with virtually every species filling some form of hunting niche within the complex food web. The planet's gravity, approximately 1.3 times that of Terra, had produced creatures of exceptional strength and resilience. The apex predators of Cretaceous jungles included massive reptilian beasts known as bloodstalkers, creatures that could grow to lengths of 15 meters and possessed razor-sharp claws capable of shearing through ceramite armor. These beasts hunted in coordinated packs, using sophisticated tactics that rivaled those employed by human military units. The bloodstalkers represented just one tier of Cretaceous' predatory hierarchy. Smaller but equally dangerous creatures filled every ecological niche, from the tree-dwelling razorwings that could strip flesh from bone in seconds to the burrowing tunnel maws that waited beneath the jungle floor for unwary prey. The planet's insect life had evolved to be particularly aggressive, with swarms of blood-drinking parasites that could drain a human of vital fluids within minutes. Even the plant life had adapted predatory characteristics, with carnivorous vines that could strangle a full-grown man and flowers that released neurotoxic spores to incapacitate potential prey. The human population of Cretaceous had survived in this hostile environment through the development of a warrior culture that emphasized constant vigilance, physical prowess, and an intimate understanding of violence. The planet's inhabitants were organized into tribal confederations that controlled specific territorial zones within the jungle, each group having adapted to the particular challenges presented by their local environment. These tribes had developed sophisticated hunting techniques and weapons specifically designed to deal with Cretaceous' predatory fauna, creating a population of natural warriors that proved ideal for space marine recruitment. The largest of these tribal groups, the Torn Chain Confederation, controlled a vast territory in the planet's northern hemisphere, where the jungle canopy was thickest and the predator density highest. Their warriors were renowned for their ability to track and kill bloodstalkers using nothing more than obsidian-tipped spears and coordinated pack tactics. The Torn Chain had developed a complex system of ritual scarification that recorded each warrior's kills, with different patterns and symbols representing various types of prey. The most accomplished hunters bore intricate designs that covered their entire torso and arms, creating a living record of their achievements that could be read by other members of the tribe. The Bone Dancers, another significant tribal group, had adapted to life in the planet's rocky highlands, where the jungle gave way to treacherous cliff faces and deep caverns. These warriors specialized in hunting the flying predators that nested in the mountainous regions, developing techniques for aerial combat that involved leaping between cliff faces and using weighted nets to bring down their prey. The Bone Dancers had incorporated the skeletal remains of their kills into their weapons and armor, creating distinctive gear that served both practical and ceremonial purposes. The ritual combat practices of Cretaceous tribes had evolved to serve multiple functions within their societies. These ceremonies were used to settle disputes, establish leadership hierarchies, and prepare young warriors for their first hunts. The combats themselves were elaborate affairs that could last for hours, with participants using a variety of weapons and fighting styles that reflected their tribal traditions. The most common form of ritual combat involved single combat between warriors armed with traditional weapons, but some tribes practiced group battles that simulated the coordinated tactics required for hunting large predators. The blood ceremonies that accompanied these ritual combats held deep spiritual significance for Cretaceous inhabitants. The tribes believed that the blood of defeated enemies or slain beasts contained essential life force that could be absorbed by the victor. Warriors would drink the blood of their fallen opponents or prey, believing that this act would grant them the strength and skills of the defeated. These practices had created a culture where bloodshed was not merely accepted, but actively celebrated as a means of spiritual and physical enhancement. The arrival of the flesh terrors on Cretaceous created an immediate resonance between the chapter's genetic predispositions and the planet's existing culture. The tribal practices of blood consumption and ritual scarification aligned perfectly with the chapter's own struggles with the Red Thirst, providing a framework for understanding and managing their condition. The planet's inhabitants viewed the Space Marines not as conquerors, but as the ultimate expression of their own warrior ideals, beings who had transcended human limitations while retaining the essential characteristics that defined Cretacean culture. The chapter's fortress monastery was constructed on a massive plateau that rose from the jungle canopy in the planet's equatorial region. This natural formation, known to the locals as the Blood Crown, provided both strategic advantages and symbolic significance. The plateau's sheer walls offered protection from the jungle's predators, while its elevated position allowed for easy observation of the surrounding territory. The site had been considered sacred by multiple tribal groups, who believed it to be the dwelling place of ancient spirits that governed the hunt. The fortress monastery's design incorporated elements of both imperial architecture and Cretacean tribal aesthetics, creating a structure that was both functional and culturally appropriate. The main walls were constructed from locally quarried stone that had been reinforced with imported ceramite and plasteel, creating defenses capable of withstanding both conventional attacks and the planet's extreme weather conditions. The exterior surfaces were decorated with carved reliefs depicting scenes of combat and hunting, many of which incorporated traditional Cretacean symbols and motifs. The interior spaces of the fortress monastery were designed to accommodate the chapter's specific needs while respecting the cultural traditions of their adopted homeworld. The main hall featured a massive collection of weapons and trophies taken from both human enemies and Cretaceous predatory fauna, creating a display that served both ceremonial and practical purposes. The chapter's battle brothers could study these artifacts to better understand the tactics and capabilities of potential opponents, while visitors from the tribal populations could appreciate the chapter's achievements according to their own cultural values. The chapter's recruitment facilities were integrated directly into the fortress monastery's structure, allowing for continuous monitoring and evaluation of potential candidates. The trials themselves took place in specially constructed chambers that could simulate various environmental conditions found throughout Cretaceous' diverse ecosystems. These facilities included climate-controlled rooms that could replicate the humid heat of the deep jungle, as well as chambers filled with live specimens of the planet's predatory species to test candidates' hunting skills and survival instincts. The recruitment process employed by the flesh terrors on Cretaceous differed significantly from standard Codex Astartes procedures, incorporating elements of tribal tradition and the chapter's specific genetic requirements. Rather than simply selecting the strongest or most skilled candidates, the chapter's recruitment officers looked for individuals who demonstrated the psychological resilience necessary to resist the Red Thirst while maintaining access to the aggressive instincts that made them effective warriors. This selection process required careful observation of candidates over extended periods, as the desired traits were often subtle and could only be identified through prolonged exposure to stress and combat situations. The initial screening process began with the identification of promising young warriors within the tribal populations. The chapter maintained recruitment stations throughout Cretaceous' inhabited regions, staffed by scout marines and chaplains who observed local combat trials and hunting expeditions. These observers looked for specific behavioral markers that indicated a candidate's suitability for Space Marine transformation, including the ability to maintain tactical awareness during intense combat, resistance to fear and pain, and most importantly, the capacity to control violent impulses when necessary. Candidates who passed the initial screening were brought to the Fortress Monastery for more intensive evaluation. The trials they faced were designed to test not only their physical capabilities, but their mental resilience under extreme stress. One of the most challenging tests involved exposure to controlled doses of combat stimulants that mimicked the effects of the Red Thirst, forcing candidates to maintain their sanity while experiencing overwhelming urges toward violence. Those who succeeded demonstrated the kind of mental fortitude that would serve them well as full battle brothers, while those who failed were either killed by their own actions or suffered permanent psychological damage. The chapter's recruitment trials also incorporated traditional Cretacean hunting practices, requiring candidates to track and kill specific predators using only primitive weapons and their own skills. These hunts took place in the jungle surrounding the fortress monastery, where candidates faced the same dangers that had shaped their tribal ancestors for generations. The successful completion of these trials required not only physical prowess, but also the tactical awareness and patience that characterized the planet's most accomplished hunters. The symbiotic relationship that developed between the flesh terrors and Cretaceous tribal populations extended far beyond simple recruitment practices. The chapter's presence on the planet provided protection for the human settlements against the most dangerous predators, while the tribes supplied not only potential recruits, but also specialized knowledge about the planet's ecosystem and hunting techniques. This exchange of resources and information created a mutually beneficial arrangement that strengthened both parties over time. The chapter's battle brothers regularly participated in large-scale hunting expeditions alongside tribal warriors, helping to cull the most dangerous predator populations while gaining valuable experience in the tactics and techniques that had been developed over generations of survival on Cretaceous. These joint operations served multiple purposes, providing training opportunities for the Space Marines while demonstrating the chapter's commitment to protecting the planet's human population. The tribal warriors who participated in these hunts gained access to advanced weapons and equipment, improving their own survival chances and enhancing their status within their communities. The cultural exchange between the flesh terrors and Cretaceous inhabitants resulted in the adoption of various tribal practices by the chapter. The ritual scarification that marked accomplished hunters became incorporated into the chapter's own traditions, with battle brothers receiving ceremonial scars to commemorate significant victories or achievements. The chapter's chaplains adapted traditional tribal blood ceremonies for use in their own religious practices, creating rituals that helped battle brothers channel their genetic predispositions in constructive ways. The chapter's influence on Cretacean culture was equally significant, as exposure to imperial technology and tactics gradually transformed the tribal societies. The most successful tribes began adopting Space Marine organizational structures and combat doctrines, creating more effective military units that could better defend their territories against predator attacks. The chapter provided training and equipment to selected tribal leaders, creating a network of allied groups that could serve as auxiliary forces when needed. The fortress monastery's integration with Cretaceous' hostile environment required constant adaptation and improvement over the centuries. The chapter's tech marines developed specialized systems for dealing with the planet's unique challenges, including atmospheric processors that could filter out toxic spores and defensive measures designed to repel the various predatory species that might threaten the installation. The monastery's walls were equipped with automated weapon systems that could track and eliminate dangerous fauna, while the interior spaces featured climate control systems that maintained optimal conditions for Space Marine physiology. The chapter's vehicle pool was adapted specifically for operations on Cretaceous, with land raiders and rhinos receiving modifications that improved their performance in jungle environments. These vehicles were equipped with enhanced filtration systems, reinforced armor plating designed to resist the claws and teeth of local predators, and specialized weapon systems optimized for close-range combat in dense vegetation. The chapter's aircraft were similarly modified, with additional armor and weaponry to protect against the flying predators that dominated Cretaceous skies. The ongoing relationship between the flesh terrors and their homeworld created a unique dynamic that influenced every aspect of the chapter's development. The constant exposure to Cretaceous' predatory environment reinforced the aggressive instincts that were already enhanced by their genetic heritage, while the tribal culture provided frameworks for understanding and managing these impulses. The planet's inhabitants served as both a source of recruits and a reminder of the chapter's connection to humanity, helping to maintain the balance between savage effectiveness and loyal service that define the Flesh Terror's identity. The combat doctrine of the Flesh Terrors evolved from a combination of their genetic predispositions, the harsh environment of their homeworld, and the tactical preferences established during their founding under Nasir Amit. Unlike many Space Marine chapters that favored balanced combined arms approaches or specialized in particular forms of warfare, the Flesh Terrors developed an overwhelming preference for close-quarters combat that bordered on obsession. This tactical philosophy was not merely a strategic choice, but a necessity born from their genetic curse, as the red thirst that plagued their warriors could only be truly satisfied through direct, violent contact with their enemies. The chapter's preference for melee combat manifested most clearly in their weapon selections and equipment modifications. While other chapters might view chainswords as secondary weapons to be used when ammunition ran low, the Flesh Terrors treated these brutal implements as primary armaments worthy of the same reverence other warriors reserved for their bolters. The chapter's Techmarines developed specialized variants of standard chainsword patterns, incorporating longer chains, more aggressive tooth configurations, and enhanced power systems that increased both cutting speed and the distinctive screaming sound that announced their approach to terrified enemies. The chainswords employed by the Flesh Terrors featured several unique modifications that reflected both their tactical preferences and their genetic heritage. The standard tooth pattern was replaced with a more aggressive design that maximized tissue damage rather than clean cuts, creating wounds that bled profusely and satisfied the warrior's psychological need for blood. The weapon's power cells were modified to provide extended operation time, allowing battle brothers to maintain continuous combat for hours without requiring reloads. Most distinctively, many chainswords incorporated collection systems that channeled enemy blood into small reservoirs, providing immediate access to the vital fluid that helped manage the red thirst during prolonged engagements. Combat knives represented another crucial component of the chapter's close-quarters arsenal. The Flesh Terrors carried multiple blade weapons, ranging from standard Astartes combat knives to specialized variants adapted from Cretacean tribal designs. These weapons were often crafted from materials harvested from their homeworld's predatory fauna, including bone and tooth fragments that had been processed and strengthened through advanced imperial metallurgy. The resulting blades possessed both symbolic significance and practical advantages, as the organic materials retained certain properties that made them particularly effective against specific types of enemies. The chapter's assault weaponry reflected their tactical doctrine's emphasis on overwhelming, brutal attacks designed to break enemy morale as much as their physical defenses. Flamers received priority allocation within Flesh Terrors forces, as these weapons provided both the close-range effectiveness the chapter preferred and the psychological impact of burning enemies alive. The chapter's Techmarines modified standard flamer patterns to increase their fuel capacity and extend their effective range, creating weapons that could maintain continuous fire for extended periods while projecting flames across greater distances than standard Imperial designs. Assault cannons held particular favor among the chapter's heavy weapons specialists, as these rapid-fire weapons could deliver devastating firepower at the close ranges where Flesh Terrors preferred to engage their enemies. The psychological effect of assault cannon fire, with its distinctive sound and the spectacular destruction it caused, aligned perfectly with the chapter's preference for tactics that demoralized opponents before physical contact was even made. The chapter maintained larger numbers of assault cannons than most other Space Marine forces, often deploying them in concentrated batteries that could shred entire enemy formations in seconds. The shock assault tactics employed by the Flesh Terrors had evolved from standard Space Marine doctrine, but incorporated elements unique to their genetic heritage and homeworld culture. Rather than the methodical, disciplined advances favored by Codex-compliant chapters, the Flesh Terrors developed a more aggressive approach that emphasized speed, violence, and psychological impact. Their assaults began with concentrated bombardments designed not to destroy enemy positions, but to wound and terrorize defenders, creating the blood and chaos that would feed their warriors' genetic hunger while weakening enemy resolve. The chapter's assault formations typically advanced in loose, predatory formations that resembled the pack hunting tactics employed by Cretaceous bloodstalkers. Individual squads would approach enemy positions from multiple angles, using terrain and cover to remain hidden until the final moments before contact. This approach required exceptional coordination and timing, as the various elements of the assault had to converge simultaneously to achieve maximum effect. The chapter's sergeants and officers developed specialized communication techniques that incorporated both traditional Vox protocols and subtle visual signals adapted from Cretacean tribal hunting practices. The moment of contact in a Flesh Terror's assault was designed to be as shocking and overwhelming as possible. The chapter's warriors would emerge from concealment with their chainswords already screaming, their armor decorated with the blood and trophies of previous battles, creating a spectacle that few enemies could face without terror. The psychological impact of this approach was often as important as the physical damage inflicted, as enemy forces would frequently break and flee before the Flesh Terrors could close to melee range. This reaction suited the chapter perfectly, as pursuing fleeing enemies allowed their warriors to satisfy their genetic urges while minimizing the risk of prolonged combat that might expose their tactical limitations. The chapter's reputation for brutal, overwhelming attacks spread throughout the Imperium's military hierarchy, creating both opportunities and challenges for their deployment. Imperial commanders who understood the Flesh Terror's capabilities would specifically request their assistance for operations requiring the rapid elimination of entrenched enemies or the breaking of particularly stubborn defensive positions. The chapter's ability to achieve decisive results in situations where other forces might become bogged down in prolonged siege warfare made them valuable assets for time-sensitive operations. However, the aftermath of Flesh Terror's operations often created diplomatic complications that limited their deployment options. The chapter's warriors had difficulty distinguishing between legitimate military targets and non-combatants once their genetic urges were fully aroused, leading to incidents where civilian populations suffered casualties that exceeded acceptable imperial standards. The chapter's leadership attempted to address these concerns through careful mission planning and the deployment of chaplains to maintain discipline, but the fundamental nature of their genetic curse made such incidents inevitable. The Death Company units that formed from battle brothers succumbing to the Black Rage represented both the chapter's greatest tactical asset and its most significant liability. These warriors, lost in visions of Sanguinius's final battle, possessed combat capabilities that exceeded even normal Space Marine standards. Their complete lack of fear, combined with enhanced strength and speed driven by their psychotic state, made them devastating shock troops capable of breaking through enemy lines that would stop conventional forces. The chapter's tactical doctrine incorporated Death Company units as expendable assets to be deployed in the most dangerous situations, where their unique capabilities could achieve objectives that would be impossible for rational warriors. The deployment of Death Company units required careful coordination with other chapter elements, as these warriors could not be relied upon to follow complex orders or maintain tactical discipline. The chapter's chaplains developed specialized protocols for directing Death Company Marines toward appropriate targets, using a combination of religious imagery and battlefield manipulation to channel their rage in useful directions. These techniques included the strategic placement of enemy banners and symbols that would trigger specific responses from the afflicted warriors, as well as the use of audio recordings that could influence their behavior through psychological association. The survival rate among Death Company Marines was significantly higher in the Flesh Terrors than in other Blood Angels successor chapters, creating unique challenges for the chapter's leadership. Warriors who should have died in glorious final charges instead returned from battle still trapped in their psychotic visions, requiring long-term containment and management. The chapter constructed specialized facilities within their fortress monastery to house these survivors, creating what amounted to a permanent population of insane but incredibly dangerous warriors who could be deployed when circumstances warranted their use. The integration of Cretacean hunting techniques into Astartes' combat doctrine represented one of the chapter's most successful adaptations of their homeworld culture. The tribal populations of Cretacia had developed sophisticated pack hunting strategies over millennia of survival against the planet's predatory fauna, creating tactical approaches that translated surprisingly well to space marine warfare. These techniques emphasized coordination, patience, and the ability to strike at precisely the right moment to achieve maximum effect with minimum risk. The pack tactics employed by Cretacean hunters involved the careful coordination of multiple individuals to isolate and overwhelm prey that might be too dangerous for any single warrior to face. The Flesh Terrors adapted these principles to squad-level operations, developing formations and movement patterns that allowed them to surround and destroy enemy units through coordinated attacks from multiple directions. These tactics required exceptional communication and timing, as the success of the entire operation depended on each element of the pack executing their role with perfect precision. The chapter's scout marines received extensive training in Cretacean hunting techniques, spending months in the planet's jungles learning to track and kill the various predatory species that inhabited the world. This training provided practical experience in stealth, patience, and the reading of environmental signs that proved invaluable in military operations. The skills developed during these hunting expeditions translated directly to battlefield reconnaissance and infiltration missions, where the ability to move undetected through hostile territory and identify enemy weaknesses could determine the success or failure of entire campaigns. The chapter's assault marines incorporated aerial hunting techniques adapted from Cretacean cliff-dwelling tribes, learning to use their jump packs not just for transportation, but as weapons in their own right. These warriors developed the ability to strike from above with devastating effect, using their momentum and the shock of their arrival to break enemy formations before engaging in close combat. The psychological impact of warriors dropping from the sky with chainswords screaming was often sufficient to rout enemy forces without the need for prolonged fighting. The chapter's vehicle crews adapted pack hunting principles to armored warfare, developing tactics that allowed their tanks and transports to operate as coordinated hunting groups rather than individual units. These formations would advance on enemy positions using terrain and mutual support to minimize their exposure to defensive fire, while maximizing their ability to deliver concentrated attacks at decisive moments. The chapter's land raiders and predator tanks were modified with additional close-range weaponry that reflected their preference for violent, decisive engagements over long-range firefights. The Flesh Terrors' approach to urban warfare incorporated elements of both Space Marine doctrine and Cretacean hunting techniques, creating a unique tactical approach that proved devastatingly effective in built-up areas. The chapter's warriors would infiltrate enemy-held cities using drainage systems, maintenance tunnels, and other concealed routes, emerging simultaneously from multiple locations to create maximum confusion and terror among defenders. These tactics required extensive reconnaissance and coordination, but the results were often decisive victories achieved with minimal friendly casualties. The chapter's preference for night operations reflected both their enhanced senses and their genetic heritage as hunters. The darkness provided natural concealment for their approach while hampering enemy visibility and coordination. The Flesh Terror's ability to track enemies by scent and their enhanced hearing made them particularly effective in low-light conditions, where they could locate and engage targets that other forces might miss entirely. The psychological impact of facing enemies who could strike from the darkness with perfect accuracy added another dimension to their tactical effectiveness. The chapter's boarding actions against enemy spacecraft represented perhaps their most specialized application of close-quarters combat doctrine. The confined spaces and close ranges typical of shipboard fighting played directly to the Flesh Terror's strengths, while the inability of enemies to retreat or call for reinforcement created ideal conditions for satisfying their genetic urges. The chapter's boarding parties were equipped with specialized gear designed for ship-to-ship combat, including magnetic boots, sealed armor systems, and weapons optimized for fighting in zero-gravity environments. The integration of these various tactical elements created a combat doctrine that was uniquely suited to the Flesh Terror's genetic heritage and cultural background. Their approach to warfare emphasized aggression, speed, and psychological impact over the methodical, disciplined approaches favored by many other chapters. While this doctrine had limitations in certain types of operations, particularly those requiring extended sieges or complex coordination with other Imperial forces, it proved devastatingly effective in the kinds of rapid, decisive engagements that characterized much of the Imperium's military operations. The relationship between the Flesh Terrors and their parent chapter, the Blood Angels, remained complex and fraught with tension throughout the millennia following the Second Founding. While both chapters shared the same genetic heritage and revered Sanguinius as their primarch, the increasingly savage nature of the Flesh Terrors created a growing divide that would influence their interactions for centuries to come. The Blood Angels, despite their own struggles with the Red Thirst and Black Rage, maintained a veneer of nobility and cultural refinement that stood in stark contrast to the brutal pragmatism that characterized their successor chapter. The first major joint operation between the two chapters occurred during the War of the False Primarch in the 33rd millennium, when both forces were deployed to suppress a massive rebellion that threatened to tear apart entire sectors of the Imperium. The Blood Angels arrived at the conflict zone with their typical pageantry, their golden armor gleaming, and their banners displaying the artistic achievements that had made them famous throughout the galaxy. The Flesh Terrors, by contrast, emerged from their strike cruisers bearing the crude trophies and blood-stained ceramite that had become their trademark, immediately creating a visual dichotomy that reflected their divergent approaches to warfare. The tactical coordination between the two chapters during this campaign revealed fundamental differences in their combat philosophies. The Blood Angels favored methodical advances supported by coordinated fire support, their movements precise and disciplined, even when engaging in close combat. Their assault companies moved like dancers, each warrior's position carefully calculated to maximize effectiveness while maintaining the aesthetic beauty that the chapter prized. The Flesh Terrors, meanwhile, attacked with the savage efficiency of predators, their formations loose and aggressive, designed to overwhelm enemies through sheer ferocity rather than tactical elegance. The aftermath of joint engagements often created uncomfortable situations for both chapters. Blood Angels warriors would survey battlefields where their cousins had fought, finding scenes of carnage that exceeded even their own standards for violence. Enemy corpses bore the marks of prolonged mutilation, having been torn apart by chainswords and combat knives long after any tactical necessity had ended. The Flesh Terror's tendency to collect trophies from fallen enemies, including teeth, bones, and other body parts, horrified many Blood Angels who viewed such practices as barbaric and beneath the dignity of Sanguinius's sons. The command structure during joint operations required careful negotiation between the chapter's leadership. Blood Angels commanders expected their orders to be followed with the precision and discipline that characterized their own forces, while Flesh Terror's officers understood that their warriors required more flexible tactical frameworks that could accommodate their genetic predispositions. These differences led to several incidents where Flesh Terror's units broke formation to pursue fleeing enemies, disrupting carefully planned maneuvers and creating gaps in the battle line that enemy forces attempted to exploit. The relationship between the chapter's chaplains proved particularly strained, as these spiritual leaders approached their duties from fundamentally different perspectives. Blood Angels chaplains emphasized the artistic and cultural aspects of their Primarch's legacy, conducting elaborate ceremonies that celebrated beauty and perfection alongside martial prowess. The Flesh Terror's chaplains, by contrast, focused on managing their warriors' genetic curses through rituals that incorporated bloodletting and controlled violence, practices that their Blood Angels counterparts found disturbing and potentially heretical. The management of Death Company Marines during joint operations created additional complications. The Blood Angels maintained strict protocols for their afflicted warriors, viewing them as tragic figures deserving of honor and respect even in their madness. The Flesh Terrors treated their Death Company as expendable shock troops, deploying them in suicidal charges with little regard for their survival or dignity. This fundamental difference in approach led to heated discussions between the chapter's leadership, with Blood Angels officers arguing that such treatment dishonored the memory of Sanguinius and the sacred nature of the Black Rage. The genetic monitoring protocols employed by both chapters revealed disturbing trends in the Flesh Terror's gene seed stability. Blood Angels apothecaries, who examined samples from their successor chapter, documented mutation rates that far exceeded anything observed in their own forces, along with behavioral modifications that suggested accelerating genetic degradation. These findings prompted several attempts at intervention, with Blood Angels medical specialists offering to assist in stabilizing the Flesh Terror's genetic heritage through advanced treatment protocols and gene therapy techniques. The Flesh Terror's response to these offers of assistance was mixed, with some elements of their leadership welcoming the opportunity to address their genetic problems, while others viewed the Blood Angels' concern as condescending interference. The chapter's pride in their savage reputation and their adaptation to their genetic curses created resistance to treatments that might reduce their combat effectiveness, even if such interventions could improve their long-term survival prospects. This tension between accepting help and maintaining independence would characterize the relationship between the chapters for centuries. The participation of both chapters in the defense of Baal during Hive Fleet Leviathan's assault in the 41st millennium represented a crucial test of their ability to cooperate despite their differences. The Blood Angels had issued a call for aid to all their successor chapters, requesting assistance in defending their homeworld against the greatest threat they had ever faced. The Flesh Terrors responded immediately, deploying their entire chapter strength to support their parent legion despite the ongoing tensions between their forces. The battle for Baal saw both chapters fighting side by side against an enemy that threatened to consume everything they held sacred. The Tyranids' complete lack of fear or morale made them ideal opponents for the Flesh Terror's brutal combat style, as the aliens would continue fighting regardless of the psychological impact of their savage attacks. The Blood Angels found themselves adapting elements of their successors' tactics, embracing a more aggressive approach that better suited the nature of their enemies. The relationship between the Flesh Terrors and other Blood Angels' successor chapters proved equally complex, with each interaction shaped by the specific characteristics and traditions of the chapters involved. The Angels in Carmine, known for their disciplined approach to warfare and their emphasis on tactical precision, found themselves frequently at odds with the Flesh Terror's more chaotic combat style. Joint operations between these chapters often resulted in friction, as the Angels in Carmine's methodical planning clashed with the Flesh Terror's preference for aggressive, improvisational tactics. The Angels in Carmine's approach to managing their genetic heritage differed significantly from that of the Flesh Terrors. While both chapters suffered from the Red Thirst and Black Rage, the Angels in Carmine had developed sophisticated meditation techniques and psychological conditioning programs designed to suppress these impulses. Their warriors underwent extensive mental training that emphasized self-control and discipline, creating soldiers who could function effectively despite their genetic predispositions. The Flesh Terrors viewed these techniques with suspicion, believing that suppressing their natural instincts would reduce their combat effectiveness and dishonor their heritage. The rivalry between the Angels in Carmine and Flesh Terrors extended beyond tactical differences to encompass their fundamental approaches to Space Marine existence. The Angels in Carmine maintained extensive cultural programs, including art studios, libraries, and music conservatories that preserved the more refined aspects of their Primarch's legacy. The Flesh Terrors saw these pursuits as wasteful diversions that diverted resources from military preparation and training. This philosophical divide created tension during joint operations, as each chapter questioned the other's priorities and commitment to their duties. The Angels Vermilion presented a different set of challenges for the Flesh Terrors, as this chapter had developed its own unique approach to managing the genetic curse that plagued all of Sanguinius's sons. The Angels Vermilion had embraced certain aspects of their vampiric nature, developing rituals and practices that incorporated blood consumption as a regular part of their existence. While this approach shared some similarities with the Flesh Terror's own methods, the Angels Vermilion maintained a level of ceremony and restraint that contrasted sharply with their cousins' more savage practices. The Angels Vermilion's blood rituals were conducted with religious solemnity, treating the consumption of blood as a sacred act that connected them to their primarch sacrifice. The chapter's chaplains had developed elaborate ceremonies that transformed what could have been seen as barbaric behavior into spiritual communion, creating a framework that allowed their warriors to satisfy their genetic urges while maintaining their dignity and honor. The Flesh Terrors found these rituals overly complicated and restrictive, preferring their own more direct approach to managing their thirst. The competition between the Angels Vermilion and Flesh Terrors often manifested in their recruitment practices and territorial disputes. Both chapters sought to recruit from populations that possessed the psychological and physical characteristics necessary to resist their genetic curses, leading to conflicts over access to suitable worlds and candidates. The Angels Vermilion's more refined approach to recruitment often proved more appealing to planetary governors and imperial administrators, who viewed their ceremonies and traditions as more civilized than the Flesh Terror's brutal selection processes. The broader Blood Angels family faced collective challenges that required cooperation despite their individual differences and rivalries. The genetic instability that affected all of Sanguinius's sons created shared problems that no single chapter could address alone. The pooling of resources and research data between the various successor chapters became essential for understanding and potentially treating the conditions that threatened their long-term survival. These collaborative efforts required the chapters to set aside their differences and work together toward common goals. The establishment of joint research facilities and genetic monitoring programs represented one of the most successful examples of cooperation between the Blood Angels and their successors. These installations, hidden on remote worlds throughout the Imperium, brought together apothecaries and researchers from multiple chapters to study the Red Thirst and Black Rage. The Flesh Terrors contributed valuable data from their own experiences, as their severe manifestations of the genetic curse provided insights that might not have been available from studying less affected populations. The sharing of genetic material between the chapters proved more controversial, as each group jealously guarded their gene seed stocks and was reluctant to risk contamination from potentially corrupted samples. The Flesh Terror's gene seed was considered particularly dangerous due to its high mutation rate and the severity of the conditions it produced. However, the chapter's unique adaptations also made their genetic material valuable for research purposes, as studying their mutations could provide insights into the underlying mechanisms that caused the Red Thirst and Black Rage. The political implications of the relationships between the Blood Angels and their successors extended beyond military cooperation to encompass their standing within the broader Imperium. The Blood Angels' reputation for nobility and cultural achievement helped to shield their successor chapters from scrutiny that might otherwise have resulted in censure or dissolution. The Flesh Terrors, in particular, benefited from this protection, as their savage reputation and genetic instability might have attracted unwanted attention from imperial authorities without the Blood Angels' influence. The chapter's participation in major imperial campaigns, alongside their parent legion and brother chapters, provided opportunities to demonstrate their value despite their flaws. The Flesh Terror's effectiveness in specific types of warfare, particularly operations requiring rapid, decisive action against entrenched enemies, made them valuable assets that imperial commanders were willing to overlook certain behavioral issues to retain. Their ability to achieve results in situations where other forces might fail helped to justify their continued existence and deployment. The training exchanges between the chapters created opportunities for knowledge transfer and mutual improvement, despite the tensions that often characterized their relationships. Flesh Terror's warriors who served alongside Blood Angels units gained exposure to different tactical approaches and combat techniques, while their cousins learned to appreciate the effectiveness of more aggressive methods. These exchanges were carefully managed to prevent conflicts and ensure that both sides benefited from the experience. The ceremonial aspects of inter-chapter relationships required careful navigation of competing traditions and expectations. The Blood Angels' emphasis on pageantry and formal protocol often clashed with the Flesh Terror's more pragmatic approach to military ceremony. Joint celebrations and commemorative events had to be structured to accommodate both chapters' needs while avoiding situations that might escalate into conflicts. The development of hybrid ceremonies that incorporated elements from both traditions represented a compromise that allowed for meaningful cooperation while respecting each chapter's unique identity. The ongoing evolution of relationships between the Blood Angels and their successors reflected the changing nature of the Imperium itself. As the galaxy became increasingly dangerous and resources more scarce, the luxury of maintaining strict adherence to traditional protocols became less important than achieving military objectives. The Flesh Terror's brutal effectiveness made them valuable allies despite their flaws, while the Blood Angels' political influence and resources provided protection and support that the successor chapters could not obtain elsewhere. The Flesh Terror's reputation as the Imperium's most savage Space Marine chapter was forged through countless campaigns across the galaxy, where their brutal efficiency and uncompromising approach to warfare earned them both fear and respect among Imperial commanders. Their deployment patterns reflected the specific nature of their combat capabilities, with the chapter frequently called upon to handle situations that required overwhelming violence and the complete elimination of enemy forces. The chapter's willingness to accept missions that other forces might consider too dangerous or morally questionable made them valuable assets in the Imperium's endless wars. The Ghoul Stars campaigns of the 34th millennium provided the Flesh Terrors with their first major opportunity to demonstrate their effectiveness against Xenos threats on a galactic scale. This region of space, located beyond the galaxy's eastern rim, had become infested with various alien species that posed significant threats to nearby Imperial worlds. The area's isolation and the bizarre nature of many of its inhabitants made it an ideal testing ground for the chapter's aggressive tactics and genetic predispositions. The campaign against the Sither Fiends represented one of the chapter's most challenging early engagements. These creatures, resembling massive cybernetic spiders with razor-sharp limbs and acid-spitting capabilities, had established hive complexes on 17 different worlds throughout the region. The standard Imperial approach of orbital bombardment, followed by ground assault, proved ineffective against enemies that could burrow deep underground and emerge behind Imperial lines without warning. The Flesh Terrors adapted their tactics to match their opponents' capabilities, developing specialized tunnel fighting techniques that emphasized close-quarters combat in confined spaces. The chapter's assault squads proved particularly effective in the underground battles against the Sither Fiends. Their jump packs allowed them to navigate the complex three-dimensional tunnel networks that honeycombed the infested worlds, while their preference for chainswords and combat knives gave them advantages in the cramped conditions where ranged weapons were often impractical. The psychological impact of Space Marines emerging from tunnel mouths with their weapons screaming proved devastating to the alien creatures, many of which fled deeper underground rather than face the Flesh Terrors in direct combat. The Purge of Vorlex 7 became legendary within the chapter's chronicles for the sheer scale of carnage achieved by a single company of Flesh Terrors. The world had been overrun by a species of parasitic organisms that converted human hosts into mindless killing machines, creating an army of infected civilians that numbered in the millions. Other Imperial forces had attempted to retake the world through conventional means, but the infected humans' complete lack of fear and their willingness to sacrifice themselves in suicidal attacks had stalled all previous efforts. Captain Karax of the Fourth Company led the Flesh Terrors' assault on Vorlex 7 with a force of just 93 Space Marines, facing odds that would have deterred most commanders. The captain's strategy involved the systematic destruction of the planet's population centers, using the chapter's preference for close combat to eliminate infected civilians in brutal melee engagements that satisfied their genetic urges while achieving tactical objectives. The campaign lasted 6 weeks, during which the Flesh Terrors killed an estimated 2 million infected humans without suffering a single casualty. The chapter's operations against orc incursions throughout the Segmentum Solar established their reputation as specialists in combating greenskin threats. The orcs' natural aggression and love of combat made them ideal opponents for the Flesh Terrors, as both sides could engage in the kind of savage warfare that satisfied their respective natures. The chapter's understanding of pack hunting tactics, derived from their Cretacean heritage, proved particularly effective against orc mob formations that relied on overwhelming numbers rather than tactical sophistication. The Bloodfang Crusade against Wascarjo lasted for 3 years and involved the systematic elimination of orc forces across 47 different worlds. The Greenskins had established a massive empire in the Ultima Segmentum, threatening several important imperial trade routes and manufacturing centers. The Flesh Terrors were deployed as part of a larger imperial force that included elements from 6 different Space Marine chapters, 3 Titan legions, and dozens of Imperial Guard regiments. The chapter's role in this campaign focused on rapid strikes against orc leadership, using their speed and savagery to eliminate key targets before the Greenskins could organize effective resistance. The battle for Scarjaw's fortress on the world of Grimskull demonstrated the Flesh Terrors' ability to adapt their tactics to overcome even the most formidable defenses. The Orc Warboss had constructed a massive stronghold from scavenged Imperial vehicles and alien technology, creating a fortress that had resisted siege for over a year. The Flesh Terrors' assault began with a series of diversionary attacks that drew the Orcs' attention to the fortress's main gates, while the chapter's assault companies used their jump packs to infiltrate the stronghold from above. The close quarters fighting within Scarjaw's fortress played directly to the Flesh Terror's strengths, as the cramped corridors and rooms prevented the orcs from using their numerical advantage effectively. The chapter's warriors moved through the fortress like predators, using their enhanced senses to track enemies through the maze of interconnected chambers. The battle culminated in a direct confrontation between Captain Karax and Warboss Scarjo himself, a duel that lasted for over an hour and ended with the orc leader's decapitation by the captain's power sword. The Third War for Armageddon marked a significant milestone in the Flesh Terrors' history, as it represented their first major deployment alongside multiple other Imperial forces in a campaign of galactic importance. The chapter's participation in this conflict demonstrated both their tactical capabilities and the challenges that arose when their savage nature clashed with the expectations of other Imperial commanders. The war's scale and complexity required unprecedented levels of coordination between different military organizations, testing the Flesh Terrors' ability to function as part of a larger strategic framework. The chapter's initial deployment to Armageddon placed them in the Hive Infernus Theater, where they were tasked with defending the massive industrial complex against orc assault forces. The urban environment provided ideal conditions for the Flesh Terrors' preferred combat style, as the maze of factories, refineries, and residential blocks created numerous opportunities for close quarters engagements. The chapter's warriors adapted quickly to the unique challenges of hive warfare, using their knowledge of pack hunting to navigate the complex 3-dimensional battle space. The defense of Manufactorum Gamma 7 became one of the most celebrated actions of the Third War for Armageddon, as a single squad of Flesh Terrors held off an entire orc warband for 72 hours. Sergeant Harath and his 9 battle brothers had been conducting a reconnaissance mission when the facility came under attack by over 300 greenskins. Rather than withdrawing, the sergeant chose to defend the Manufactorum's critical production lines, using the industrial equipment as weapons and fortifications in their desperate battle. The Flesh Terrors' tactics during the Manufactorum defense demonstrated their ability to improvise and adapt under extreme pressure. The squad used the facility's heavy machinery to create choke points that forced the orcs to attack in smaller groups, negating their numerical advantage. Molten metal from the production lines became improvised weapons, while the chapter's warriors used their chainswords to sabotage orc equipment and vehicles. The battle ended when reinforcements from the Steel Legion arrived to find the Manufactorum littered with orc corpses, and the Flesh Terrors still fighting despite suffering severe casualties. The cooperation between the Flesh Terrors and other Imperial forces during the Armageddon campaign revealed both the advantages and limitations of their combat doctrine. The chapter's ability to achieve rapid, decisive results in specific tactical situations made them valuable assets for breakthrough operations and the elimination of key targets. However, their tendency toward excessive violence and their difficulty in distinguishing between military and civilian targets created complications when operating in populated areas or alongside forces that maintained stricter rules of engagement. The chapter's relationship with the Armageddon Steel Legion proved particularly complex, as the Guard Regiment's disciplined approach to warfare contrasted sharply with the Flesh Terror's more aggressive methods. The Steel Legion's commanders initially viewed the Space Marines with suspicion, having heard reports of their savage reputation and brutal tactics. However, the chapter's effectiveness in combat situations where other forces had failed gradually earned them respect, if not complete acceptance, from their Imperial Guard allies. The joint operations between the Flesh Terrors and other Space Marine chapters during the Armageddon campaign provided opportunities for tactical innovation and mutual learning. The Salamander's emphasis on protecting civilian populations influenced the Flesh Terrors to develop more precise targeting methods that reduced collateral damage, while the chapter's aggressive assault tactics proved valuable for breaking through orc defensive positions that had stalled other forces. These exchanges of knowledge and technique helped to refine the chapter's combat doctrine while maintaining their essential character. The Badab War represented one of the most controversial periods in the Flesh Terror's history, as the chapter found itself deployed against fellow Space Marines who had been declared traitors by the High Lords of Terra. The conflict began when the Astral Claws chapter, led by Luft Huron, refused to surrender control of the Badab system and its valuable resources to Imperial authorities. The rebellion quickly spread to include several other chapters and Imperial organizations, creating a civil war that threatened to tear apart entire sectors of the Imperium. The Flesh Terrors' involvement in the Badab War was complicated by their genetic heritage and their relationship with other Space Marine chapters. The prospect of fighting against fellow Astartes troubled many of the chapter's warriors, who had been trained to view other Space Marines as brothers in arms despite their differences. The chapter's chaplains worked tirelessly to maintain morale and discipline, emphasizing the importance of loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium above all other considerations. The siege of Badab Primaris tested the Flesh Terror's ability to conduct prolonged operations against fortified positions defended by experienced Space Marine opponents. The Astral Claws had transformed their homeworld into a fortress that rivaled any Imperial stronghold, with defensive systems designed specifically to counter Space Marine assault tactics. The chapter's preference for rapid, aggressive attacks proved less effective against enemies who understood their methods and had prepared countermeasures accordingly. The Flesh Terrors adapted their tactics for the siege by incorporating elements of their Cretacean hunting heritage, using patience and stealth to identify weaknesses in the Astral Claws' defenses. The chapter's scouts spent months infiltrating the outer defensive perimeters, gathering intelligence about enemy positions and identifying potential targets for assault operations. This methodical approach contrasted with their usual aggressive style, but proved necessary for achieving success against such formidable opponents. The battle for the Badab system's orbital facilities demonstrated the Flesh Terror's expertise in boarding actions and ship-to-ship combat. The chapter's assault companies specialized in these operations, using their preference for close-quarters combat to overcome the defenders of space stations and orbital platforms. The confined spaces and close ranges typical of void warfare played directly to their strengths, while the psychological impact of their savage reputation often caused enemy crews to surrender rather than face them in direct combat. The chapter's participation in the final assault on the Palace of Thorns, the Astral Claw's primary fortress, showcased their ability to function as part of a larger Imperial force while maintaining their distinctive combat style. The Flesh Terrors were assigned to assault the fortress's lower levels, where the close-quarters fighting would favor their aggressive tactics. The chapter's warriors fought through miles of underground tunnels and chambers, facing desperate defenders who knew that defeat meant death or worse. The aftermath of the Badab War left the Flesh Terrors with mixed feelings about their role in the conflict. While they had served the Imperium faithfully and helped to eliminate a significant threat to Imperial unity, the experience of fighting against fellow Space Marines had been traumatic for many of the chapter's warriors. The chapter's leadership implemented new training programs designed to prepare their forces for similar conflicts, recognizing that the galaxy's increasing instability made such civil wars increasingly likely. The Xenos extermination campaigns that followed the Badab War provided the Flesh Terrors with opportunities to return to the kind of warfare that suited their nature and capabilities. The chapter's reputation for leaving no survivors made them ideal candidates for operations requiring the complete elimination of alien threats, particularly those involving species that could not be negotiated with or contained through conventional means. These campaigns allowed the chapter to rebuild their strength and morale while serving the Imperium's broader strategic objectives. The cleansing of the Howling Stars involved the systematic elimination of a nomadic alien species that had been raiding Imperial shipping lanes for over a century. The creatures, known as Void Stalkers, possessed natural abilities that allowed them to survive in the vacuum of space and phase through solid matter, making them extremely difficult to combat using conventional weapons and tactics. The Flesh Terrors' approach to this threat involved tracking the aliens to their hidden bases and engaging them in close combat where their phasing abilities were less effective. The campaign against the Void Stalkers required the chapter to develop new techniques for fighting enemies that could appear and disappear at will. The Flesh Terrors' enhanced senses, particularly their ability to track by scent, proved crucial for detecting the aliens even when they were phased out of normal space. The chapter's warriors learned to anticipate their enemies' movements and strike at the precise moment when the creatures materialized to attack, creating a deadly dance of violence that played out across dozens of different battlefields. The Purge of Hive Fleet Dagon's splinter fleets demonstrated the Flesh Terrors' effectiveness against Tyranid forces, as the aliens' complete lack of fear and their willingness to fight to the death made them ideal opponents for the chapter's savage combat style. The Tyranids' biological weapons and adaptive capabilities posed unique challenges that required the chapter to constantly evolve their tactics and equipment. The campaign lasted for 5 years and involved battles on over 30 different worlds, each presenting unique environmental and tactical challenges. The chapter's approach to fighting Tyranids emphasized the importance of eliminating synapse creatures that coordinated the alien swarms. The Flesh Terrors' assault squads specialized in deep strike operations designed to penetrate Tyranid formations and eliminate these key targets before they could adapt to Imperial tactics. The chapter's warriors developed specialized techniques for identifying and targeting synapse creatures, using their enhanced senses to distinguish between different types of Tyranid organisms, even in the chaos of battle. The defense of the Cadian Gate during the 13th Black Crusade marked the chapter's participation in one of the most significant conflicts in Imperial history. The Flesh Terrors deployed their entire chapter strength to assist in holding the crucial defensive line that protected the Imperium's heartland from chaos incursion. The chapter's warriors fought alongside forces from across the galaxy, demonstrating their ability to function as part of the largest military coalition in Imperial history while maintaining their distinctive combat effectiveness. The leadership of the Flesh Terrors has been defined by individuals who embodied both the noble aspirations of their Sanguinian heritage and the savage realities of their genetic curse. These figures, ranging from chapter masters who fought to preserve their chapter's future to heroes who fell to the Black Rage in glorious final battles, represent the complex duality that has characterized the chapter throughout its existence. Their stories illuminate the constant struggle between maintaining the discipline necessary for Space Marine operations and embracing the violent instincts that made them so effective in combat. Gabriel Seth assumed command of the Flesh Terrors during one of the darkest periods in their history, when the chapter's numbers had dwindled to fewer than 400 battle brothers, and their reputation for excessive violence had made them pariahs among other Imperial forces. The genetic degradation that plagued their gene seed had accelerated to the point where new recruits were succumbing to the Red Thirst within years of their transformation, while the Black Rage claimed veterans at an unprecedented rate. Seth inherited a chapter that stood on the precipice of extinction, facing the very real possibility that the Flesh Terrors would cease to exist within a few generations. Seth's approach to leadership differed markedly from his predecessors, who had largely embraced the chapter's savage reputation and made little effort to address their genetic problems. The new chapter master recognized that the Flesh Terror's survival depended on finding ways to channel their violent instincts more effectively while reducing the rate of genetic degradation that threatened their existence. His reforms began with a comprehensive review of the chapter's recruitment and training practices, identifying areas where modifications could improve the survival rate of new initiates without compromising their combat effectiveness. The chapter master's first major initiative involved the establishment of new psychological screening protocols for potential recruits. Rather than simply selecting the most aggressive candidates from Cretaceous tribal populations, Seth ordered his chaplains to identify individuals who demonstrated both violent capability and mental resilience. These new criteria required more extensive testing periods, as the desired traits were often subtle and could only be identified through prolonged observation under stress. The resulting recruitment process took longer and yielded fewer candidates, but those who survived the selection proved more resistant to the genetic curse that plagued the chapter. Seth's reforms extended to the chapter's training regimens, which had traditionally emphasized aggression and close-quarters combat at the expense of tactical flexibility. The chapter master introduced new courses that taught battle brothers to recognize and control their violent impulses, using meditation techniques adapted from various imperial traditions. These practices did not suppress the warrior's natural aggression, but rather channeled it more effectively, allowing them to maintain tactical awareness even when the Red Thirst was upon them. The training also included scenarios that required restraint and discrimination, preparing the chapter's warriors for operations where excessive violence could create diplomatic complications. The chapter master's most controversial reform involved the reorganization of the chapter's death company protocols. Previous leadership had treated warriors who succumbed to the Black Rage as expendable assets, deploying them in suicidal charges with little regard for their survival or the tactical value of their sacrifice. Seth recognized that the chapter's high survival rate among Death Company Marines created opportunities for more strategic deployment of these formidable warriors. He established new containment facilities within the Fortress Monastery and developed protocols for managing long-term Death Company survivors, treating them as valuable resources rather than tragic casualties. Seth's leadership style reflected his understanding of the chapter's dual nature, combining the savage efficiency that made them effective warriors with the discipline necessary for long-term survival. He led from the front in combat situations, wielding his massive chainsword with devastating effect while maintaining the tactical awareness necessary to coordinate complex operations. His presence on the battlefield served as both inspiration and control mechanism for his warriors, as his ability to channel the Red Thirst constructively provided a model for other battle brothers to follow. The chapter master's relationship with other Imperial forces required careful management, as the Flesh Terror's reputation for excessive violence had made many commanders reluctant to request their assistance. Seth worked to rebuild these relationships through a series of carefully chosen deployments that demonstrated the chapter's value while showcasing their improved discipline. These operations were selected specifically for their strategic importance and their suitability to the chapter's combat style, allowing the Flesh Terrors to achieve impressive results while minimizing the risk of incidents that might damage their reputation further. The legacy of previous chapter masters provided both inspiration and cautionary examples for Seth's reforms. Nasir Amit, the chapter's founding leader, had established many of the traditions and practices that define the Flesh Terror's identity. His embrace of the chapter's savage nature had created a force of unparalleled effectiveness in close combat, but his failure to address the genetic problems that plagued his warriors had set the stage for the crisis that Seth inherited. The Flesh Terror's reputation as the most brutal of all Space Marine chapters could be traced directly to Amit's leadership and his willingness to deploy his warriors without restraint against any enemy. Chapter Master Karax, who led the chapter during the 35th millennium, had continued Amit's aggressive approach while expanding the Flesh Terror's operational scope. His campaigns against Xenos threats throughout the galaxy had earned the chapter significant victories and enhanced their reputation among Imperial commanders who needed enemies eliminated without concern for collateral damage. However, Karax's failure to address the accelerating genetic degradation had worsened the chapter's long-term prospects, as his focus on immediate military success came at the expense of sustainable recruitment and training practices. The reign of Chapter Master Thrax during the 38th millennium had been marked by increasingly desperate attempts to maintain the chapter's numbers through relaxed recruitment standards and experimental gene therapy techniques. His willingness to accept candidates who would have been rejected under previous protocols had temporarily stabilized the chapter's strength, but the long-term consequences of these decisions had accelerated the genetic problems that plagued subsequent generations. Thrax's legacy served as a warning about the dangers of prioritizing short-term solutions over sustainable practices. The chapter's chaplains played crucial roles in managing both the spiritual needs of the Battle Brothers and the practical challenges posed by their genetic heritage. These warrior priests had developed specialized techniques for identifying the early signs of the Red Thirst and Black Rage, allowing for intervention before affected individuals became completely lost to their conditions. The chaplain's duties extended beyond traditional spiritual guidance to include medical monitoring, psychological counseling, and tactical coordination during combat operations where genetic factors might influence warrior behavior. Chaplain Apian had served the chapter for over 3 centuries, developing many of the rituals and practices that helped Battle Brothers manage their violent impulses. His understanding of the psychological mechanisms underlying the Red Thirst had enabled him to create meditation techniques that provided temporary relief from the condition's worst effects. Apian's work with Death Company Marines had yielded insights into the nature of the Black Rage that proved valuable for the chapter's broader understanding of their genetic curse. His detailed records of various cases had become essential references for other chaplains dealing with similar situations. The chaplain's approach to managing the Death Company differed significantly from standard Blood Angels practices, as the high survival rate among Flesh Terror's warriors required long-term containment and care protocols. Apian had developed specialized chambers within the fortress monastery where affected Battle Brothers could be housed safely, while attempts were made to reach them through their psychotic visions. These facilities were designed to withstand the incredible strength of Space Marines in the grip of the Black Rage, with reinforced walls and restraint systems that could hold even the most violent individuals without causing permanent injury. Chaplain Lemartz of the Blood Angels had worked closely with the Flesh Terror's spiritual leaders during joint operations, sharing techniques and insights that proved valuable for managing their respective Death Company populations. His unique status as a warrior who had succumbed to the Black Rage, but retained enough sanity to function in combat, provided a model that the Flesh Terror's chaplains sought to replicate among their own afflicted brothers. The collaboration between these spiritual leaders had yielded new approaches to treating the genetic curse that affected all of Sanguinius's sons. The chapter's recruitment of chaplains from their own ranks had created a cadre of spiritual leaders who understood the specific challenges faced by the flesh terrors. These warrior priests had experienced the red thirst firsthand and could provide guidance based on personal experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Their ability to relate to the struggles of their battle brothers had made them more effective counselors and spiritual guides, as they could offer practical advice for managing violent impulses while maintaining tactical effectiveness. The heroes who had fallen to the Black Rage represented some of the chapter's most tragic and glorious figures, warriors whose final battles had become legendary within the chapter's chronicles. These individuals had served with distinction for decades or centuries before succumbing to the genetic curse, their transformation from disciplined space marines into psychotic killing machines serving as both inspiration and warning for their surviving brothers. Their stories were preserved in the chapter's records not just as historical accounts, but as tactical studies that could provide insights into the nature of the Black Rage and its effects on combat performance. Sergeant Carax of the 3rd Company had been one of the chapter's most accomplished veterans before his fall to the Black Rage during the cleansing of Vorlex Prime. His 23 years of service had included participation in over 40 major engagements, during which he had demonstrated exceptional tactical skill and leadership ability. The onset of his condition had been sudden and violent, occurring during a routine patrol mission when the sergeant began experiencing visions of Sanguinius's final battle. His transformation from rational leader to psychotic warrior had been witnessed by his entire squad, creating a traumatic experience that affected the survivors for years afterward. The final battle of Sergeant Carax had taken place in the ruins of Vorlex Prime's primary hive city, where he had single-handedly held off an entire orc warband while his squad evacuated civilian survivors. Armed with only his chainsword and bolt pistol, the sergeant had fought for over 6 hours against overwhelming odds, his Black Rage enhanced strength and speed, allowing him to carve through greenskin formations that should have overwhelmed him. The battle had ended when the sergeant finally succumbed to his injuries, but not before eliminating over 200 orc warriors and buying precious time for the evacuation to succeed. Captain Herath of the 7th Company had led his warriors for over a century before falling to the Black Rage during the defense of Cadia. His condition had manifested gradually over several months, beginning with minor episodes of confusion and aggression that had been attributed to combat stress. The captain's transformation had been particularly tragic because of his previous efforts to help other battle brothers manage their own struggles with the genetic curse. His understanding of the condition had made him acutely aware of what was happening to him, creating a psychological torment that had accelerated his decline. The captain's final deployment had been against a Chaos Space Marine warband that had infiltrated Cadia's defensive perimeter. Herath had led his company in a desperate assault against the traitors, his Black Rage enhanced aggression proving devastatingly effective against enemies who had expected to face rational opponents. The captain had personally slain the warband's leader in single combat, using his bare hands to tear apart the Chaos Marine's power armor and crush his skull. The victory had come at a terrible cost, as Herath had been mortally wounded in the battle and had died believing himself to be Sanguinius facing Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Brother Sergeant Malak had been known throughout the chapter for his exceptional skill with close combat weapons, particularly his mastery of the chainsword techniques that had become the Flesh Terror's signature. His fall to the Black Rage had occurred during a boarding action against an Eldar pirate vessel, where the confined spaces and close quarters fighting had triggered visions of the final battle aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The sergeant's transformation had been witnessed by his entire assault squad, who had watched in horror as their leader began attacking anything that moved, including his own battle brothers. The sergeant's final moments had been spent in single combat against an Eldar autarch who had challenged him to personal duel. Malak's Black Rage enhanced reflexes had allowed him to match the alien's supernatural speed and agility, creating a battle that had lasted for over an hour as the two warriors fought through the ship's corridors and chambers. The duel had ended when both combatants had inflicted mortal wounds upon each other, dying within moments of each other, in a display of martial prowess that had impressed even the surviving Eldar warriors. The chapter's efforts to preserve the memory and honor of these fallen heroes had led to the establishment of the Hall of the Lost within their fortress monastery. This chamber contained detailed records of every battle brother who had succumbed to the Black Rage, including tactical analyses of their final battles and personal accounts from surviving witnesses. The hall served both as a memorial to the fallen and as a research facility where the chapter's leadership could study the patterns and progression of the genetic curse that claimed so many of their warriors. The preservation of these records had proved valuable for understanding the factors that might trigger the onset of the Black Rage, as well as the tactical implications of deploying affected warriors in combat situations. The chapter's apothecaries had identified several environmental and psychological factors that seemed to increase the likelihood of a warrior succumbing to the condition, including exposure to certain types of psychic energy and prolonged periods of intense combat stress. This knowledge had enabled the development of screening protocols that could identify at-risk individuals before their condition became irreversible. The chapter's approach to honoring their fallen heroes reflected their understanding of the dual nature of the Black Rage, which transformed disciplined warriors into devastating killing machines while robbing them of their sanity and humanity. The ceremonies that commemorated these individuals emphasized both their service to the chapter and the Emperor, as well as the tragic nature of their final transformation. These rituals served to maintain morale among the surviving battle brothers while providing frameworks for understanding and accepting the genetic curse that threatened them all. The ongoing challenge of leadership within the Flesh Terrors required individuals who could balance the competing demands of maintaining combat effectiveness while managing the chapter's genetic problems. The successful leaders had been those who understood that the chapter's savage reputation was both an asset and a liability, requiring careful management to ensure that their warriors' violent instincts served the Imperium's interests rather than becoming uncontrolled destruction. The development of new leadership techniques and training programs had become essential for preparing future generations of officers to handle these complex challenges. The chapter's relationship with their genetic heritage continued to evolve under Seth's leadership, as new discoveries about the nature of the Red Thirst and Black Rage provided opportunities for more effective management techniques. The ongoing research into genetic stabilization had yielded promising results, suggesting that the chapter's long-term survival might be possible if the right combination of treatments and protocols could be developed. The leadership's commitment to this research had required significant resources and political capital, but the potential benefits justified the investment in terms of the chapter's future viability. The spiritual life of the Flesh Terrors had evolved far beyond the standard practices prescribed by the Codex Astartes, shaped by their genetic curse and the brutal traditions of their Cretacean homeworld. The chapter's rituals served multiple functions, providing psychological frameworks for managing the Red Thirst, honoring their fallen brothers, and maintaining the delicate balance between savage effectiveness and disciplined service to the Emperor. These ceremonies had developed organically over millennia, incorporating elements from Blood Angels' traditions, Cretacean tribal customs, and the unique requirements imposed by their genetic heritage. The Feast of Malediction stood as the chapter's most significant religious observance, held annually on the anniversary of Sanguinius's death aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Unlike the solemn commemorations practiced by other Blood Angel successors, the Flesh Terrors version of this ceremony embraced the darker aspects of their inheritance. The ritual began at sunset in the fortress monastery's Great Hall, where the chapter's battle brothers gathered around massive tables carved from the bones of Cretaceous apex predators. The hall's walls were decorated with the preserved heads of enemies slain in glorious combat, their empty eye sockets seeming to watch over the proceedings with silent approval. The ceremony commenced with the ritualistic consumption of blood drawn from the chapter's most honored veterans, each warrior drinking from chalices fashioned from the skulls of fallen heroes. The blood was mixed with fermented juices from Cretacean blood fruits, creating a potent mixture that heightened the drinker's senses while providing temporary relief from the gnawing hunger of the red thirst. As the warriors consumed this sacred mixture, the chapter's chaplains recited the names of all battle brothers who had fallen to the Black Rage during the previous year, their voices echoing through the hall in a haunting litany of loss and sacrifice. The Feast of Malediction progressed through several distinct phases, each designed to channel the participants' growing aggression in constructive directions. Following the initial blood consumption, the assembled warriors engaged in ritual combat using blunted weapons, their movements growing more frenzied as the ceremony's effects took hold. These mock battles served as both entertainment and training, allowing battle brothers to practice their combat techniques while providing an outlet for the violent impulses that threatened to overwhelm them. The chaplains monitored these contests carefully, intervening when necessary to prevent serious injury while allowing the warriors to satisfy their genetic urges. The ceremony's climax involved the ritual scarification of newly inducted battle brothers, marking their acceptance into the chapter's brotherhood through the permanent alteration of their flesh. The scars were carved using ceremonial knives crafted from the claws of Cretacean bloodstalkers, their razor-sharp edges creating precise wounds that would heal into distinctive patterns. Each scar told a story, recording the warrior's first kill, his survival of the transformation process, or his resistance to the red thirst during particularly challenging trials. The scarification process was conducted without anesthetic, as the pain was considered an essential component of the ritual's spiritual significance. The chapter's blood rituals extended beyond the annual Feast of Malediction to encompass a complex system of daily observances designed to manage their genetic curse. Each morning, battle brothers would participate in the Crimson Dawn ceremony, drinking small quantities of blood drawn from captured enemies or willing volunteers among the chapter's serfs. This practice provided temporary relief from the red thirst while reinforcing the warriors' connection to their predatory nature. The blood was consecrated by the chaplains using prayers adapted from ancient Cretacean hunting invocations, transforming what might have been seen as barbaric behavior into a sacred act of communion with their genetic heritage. The evening vigil represented another crucial component of the chapter's daily spiritual routine, as battle brothers gathered in small groups to meditate on their violent impulses and seek guidance from their fallen primarch. These sessions took place in chambers decorated with the preserved remains of enemies and prey, creating environments that simultaneously honored death and celebrated the hunt. The warriors would spend hours in silent contemplation, their enhanced senses detecting the lingering sense of blood and battle that permeated these sacred spaces. The chaplains taught that this meditation helped strengthen the mind's control over the body's urges, providing the mental discipline necessary to function effectively in combat while resisting the complete surrender to savage instinct. The chapter's approach to managing Death Company warriors required elaborate ceremonial frameworks that honored these fallen brothers while containing their dangerous psychoses. The rites of the lost began the moment a battle brother showed signs of succumbing to the Black Rage, with the affected warrior being escorted to specially prepared chambers within the fortress monastery's depths. These rooms were decorated with murals depicting scenes from Sanguinius's final battle, designed to provide familiar visual references that might help the afflicted warrior navigate his visions more effectively. The preparation of Death Company Marines involved complex rituals that transformed their appearance to reflect their tragic condition. Their armor was repainted in the traditional black of the Death Company, but the flesh terrors added distinctive red markings that incorporated elements from Cretacean tribal scarification patterns. These symbols served both decorative and practical purposes, as they helped identify individual warriors and provided visual cues that could influence their behavior during combat deployment. The armor's helmet was often modified to include additional breathing apparatus, as many Death Company Marines experienced respiratory difficulties due to the psychological stress of their condition. The weapons assigned to Death Company warriors received special consecration through rituals that bound them spiritually to their wielders. Chainswords were blessed with the blood of previous Death Company heroes, creating weapons that carried the spiritual essence of fallen brothers into new battles. The chapter's Techmarines worked closely with the chaplains to ensure that these weapons would function reliably, even under the extreme stress of combat with psychotic warriors, incorporating redundant systems and simplified controls that could be operated by individuals whose rational faculties had been compromised by their visions. The deployment of Death Company units required careful ceremonial preparation designed to channel their rage toward appropriate targets while minimizing the risk to friendly forces. The chaplains would conduct pre-battle rituals that used visual and auditory cues to associate enemy forces with the traitors who had slain Sanguinius, helping to focus the afflicted warrior's aggression on legitimate targets. These ceremonies included the display of enemy banners and the playing of recordings that mimicked the sounds of battle aboard the vengeful spirit, creating psychological triggers that would guide the Death Company's actions during combat. The chapter's recruitment rituals had evolved to address the specific challenges posed by their genetic heritage, incorporating extensive psychological evaluation alongside traditional tests of physical prowess. Potential recruits from Cretacea's tribal populations underwent months of observation and testing designed to identify the mental characteristics that might help them resist the red thirst and black rage. These trials included exposure to controlled stressors that mimicked the effects of the genetic curse, allowing the chapter's chaplains and apothecaries to evaluate each candidate's resilience and adaptability. The transformation process for successful recruits involved ceremonies that blended Imperial Space Marine traditions with elements adapted from Cretacean tribal coming-of-age rituals. The implantation of gene seed was preceded by purification rites that included ritual scarification and the consumption of blood drawn from the chapter's most honored veterans. These practices were designed to prepare the candidate's body and mind for the changes that would follow, while also establishing their connection to the chapter's spiritual heritage. The ceremonies took place in chambers decorated with the preserved remains of Cretacean predators, creating environments that reinforced the chapter's connection to their homeworld's hunting culture. The chapter's interpretation of the Codex Astartes reflected their unique circumstances and genetic heritage, incorporating modifications that acknowledged the realities of their condition while maintaining the essential framework of Space Marine organization. The standard tactical doctrines were adapted to account for the psychological factors that influenced their warriors' behavior, with special provisions for managing troops who might be affected by the red thirst during combat operations. These modifications included altered command structures that provided additional oversight for potentially affected units, as well as specialized communication protocols that could be used to maintain control over warriors whose rational faculties might be compromised. The chapter's approach to combat deployment incorporated ritualistic elements designed to prepare warriors psychologically for the challenges they would face. Pre-battle ceremonies included the application of war paint using pigments mixed with the blood of previous victories, creating distinctive markings that served both spiritual and practical purposes. These decorations helped identify individual warriors and their roles within the battle plan, while also providing psychological reinforcement for their connection to the chapter's martial traditions. The patterns used in these markings were adapted from Cretacean tribal designs, creating visual links between the chapter's current practices and their homeworld's ancient customs. The chapter's weapon consecration rituals ensured that their armaments carried both spiritual significance and practical enhancements suited to their combat preferences. Chainswords received particular attention, with each weapon being blessed individually using prayers that invoked the hunting spirits of Cretaceia alongside traditional imperial benedictions. The consecration process included the application of sacred oils mixed with the blood of fallen enemies, creating weapons that were both spiritually potent and psychologically satisfying for warriors struggling with the red thirst. These rituals were conducted by the chapter's chaplains in cooperation with their tech marines, ensuring that the spiritual aspects of the ceremonies did not interfere with the weapon's mechanical function. The chapter's training regimens incorporated ritualistic combat exercises that served multiple purposes beyond simple skill development. These practices included mock hunts that recreated the pack tactics used by Cretacean predators, teaching battle brothers to coordinate their actions while satisfying their genetic urges through controlled violence. The exercises took place in specially constructed environments within the fortress monastery, featuring obstacles and challenges that mimicked the conditions found on various battlefield types. The training was designed to be both physically demanding and psychologically satisfying, providing outlets for aggressive impulses while building the tactical skills necessary for effective combat performance. The chapter's approach to honoring their fallen brothers incorporated elements that reflected their understanding of death as both ending and transformation. The funeral rites for battle brothers who had died in service included the preservation of significant body parts as relics, with bones and teeth being incorporated into weapons and armor worn by surviving warriors. These practices ensured that the deceased continued to participate in the chapter's battles even after death, while also providing psychological comfort to the living who could feel the presence of their fallen brothers in their equipment. The ceremonies were conducted with solemn dignity, emphasizing the honor inherent in death in service to the emperor, while acknowledging the savage nature of the chapter's calling. The chapter's relationship with their gene seed was governed by elaborate protocols that treated this precious resource with reverence while acknowledging its corrupted nature. The harvesting of progenitor glands from fallen warriors was conducted using rituals that honored both the deceased and the genetic legacy they carried, with special prayers designed to purify the extracted material of any taint that might have accumulated during the warrior's service. These ceremonies were performed by the chapter's most senior apothecaries in cooperation with the chaplains, creating a spiritual framework that helped maintain the psychological health of those responsible for managing the chapter's genetic heritage. The chapter's adaptation of imperial religious practices reflected their unique circumstances while maintaining essential connections to the broader imperial faith. The worship of the emperor incorporated elements that emphasized his role as the ultimate predator, the apex hunter, who had claimed dominion over the galaxy through superior strength and cunning. These interpretations provided frameworks that allowed the chapter's warriors to reconcile their savage nature with their loyalty to the Imperium, creating spiritual justifications for their violent methods while maintaining their commitment to imperial service. The prayers and hymns used in these ceremonies were adapted from standard imperial texts, with modifications that incorporated hunting metaphors and references to the predatory aspects of warfare. The Flesh Terror's preference for close-quarters combat had shaped every aspect of their armory, from the modification of standard Astartes equipment to the development of entirely new weapon patterns suited to their savage fighting style. The chapter's tech marines worked in constant collaboration with their chaplains to create weapons that satisfied both the practical requirements of warfare and the psychological needs of warriors struggling with the Red Thirst. These modifications often pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable within imperial doctrine, but the results spoke for themselves in the form of devastatingly effective close combat weapons that had become the chapter's signature. The chainswords employed by the Flesh Terrors bore little resemblance to the standard patterns used by other Space Marine chapters. The chapter's tech marines had extensively modified the basic design, increasing the weapon's weight and size to deliver more devastating cuts, while extending the chain length to create a wider arc of destruction. The teeth were crafted from specially treated adamantium alloys that maintained their edge even after prolonged use, while the power systems were enhanced to provide the sustained operation necessary for extended melee engagements. Most distinctively, many weapons incorporated collection channels that directed enemy blood into small reservoirs built into the weapon's grip, allowing warriors to satisfy their genetic urges without interrupting their combat rhythm. The chapter's combat knives represented another area where standard imperial designs had been extensively modified to suit their specific needs. These weapons were often forged using materials harvested from Cretaceous predatory fauna, incorporating bone and tooth fragments that had been processed through advanced metallurgical techniques. The resulting blades possessed unique properties that made them particularly effective against certain types of armor and flesh, while their organic origins provided psychological satisfaction for warriors whose genetic heritage demanded connection to the hunt. The knives were typically carried in matched pairs, with each warrior developing personalized fighting techniques that maximized their effectiveness in close combat. The chapter's approach to bolter modifications reflected their understanding that ranged combat was often merely a prelude to the close quarters fighting they preferred. Standard bolter patterns were equipped with extended magazines and reinforced stocks that could serve as improvised clubs when ammunition ran low. The weapon's bayonet lugs were enlarged to accommodate oversized blades that could function as effective close combat weapons in their own right. Many bolters also featured specialized ammunition types designed to wound rather than kill outright, creating bleeding enemies that would satisfy the red thirst while maintaining tactical effectiveness. The chapter's heavy weapons reflected their tactical doctrine's emphasis on creating opportunities for close combat rather than engaging in prolonged firefights. Assault cannons received priority allocation due to their devastating close-range effectiveness and the psychological impact of their distinctive sound. The weapons were modified with enhanced cooling systems that allowed for sustained fire during extended engagements, while their ammunition hoppers were enlarged to provide greater capacity for the rapid-fire combat that characterized Flesh Terror's operations. The chapter maintained significantly more assault cannons than most other Space Marine forces, often deploying them in concentrated batteries that could shred enemy formations and create openings for assault troops. Flamers held particular significance within the chapter's armory, as these weapons provided both the close-range destruction they preferred and the psychological satisfaction of watching enemies burn. The standard Imperial patterns were modified with extended fuel tanks and improved nozzle designs that increased both range and fuel efficiency. The chapter's Techmarines had developed specialized fuel mixtures that burned at higher temperatures and adhered more effectively to targets, creating weapons that could maintain continuous fire for extended periods while inflicting maximum damage on enemy forces. The psychological impact of these weapons proved almost as valuable as their physical effects, as few enemies could maintain their composure when faced with the prospect of being burned alive. The chapter's power weapons represented some of their most prized possessions, with many examples dating back to the Great Crusade and bearing the accumulated battle honors of countless campaigns. These ancient weapons had been modified over the millennia to suit the chapter's evolving combat doctrine, with power fields adjusted to maximize cutting effectiveness rather than the clean kills favored by other chapters. The weapons were often decorated with trophies taken from defeated enemies, including teeth, claws, and other organic materials that served both as battle honors and psychological reinforcement for their wielder's connection to the hunt. The most revered weapons in the chapter's arsenal were the ancient chainswords that had been wielded by their founding members during the Second Founding. These relics bore the battle scars of 10,000 years of warfare, their adamantium teeth worn smooth by constant use, but still capable of devastating effectiveness in the hands of skilled warriors. The weapons were maintained by the chapter's most senior Techmarines using techniques that bordered on the ritualistic, with each component carefully preserved and replaced as necessary to ensure continued function. The chainswords were passed down through generations of warriors, creating lineages of weapon wielders that stretched back to the chapter's earliest days. The Flesh Terror's approach to armor modification reflected their understanding that protection was secondary to mobility and the psychological impact of their appearance. Standard Mark VII power armor was extensively modified with additional close combat attachments, including reinforced gauntlets equipped with retractable claws and shoulder-mounted blade arrays that could be deployed during melee engagements. The armor's paint schemes incorporated blood-red markings that served both identification and psychological purposes, while trophy racks allowed warriors to display the remains of defeated enemies as both battle honors and intimidation tools. The chapter's Terminator armor represented their most heavily modified equipment, with each suit extensively customized for close-quarters combat effectiveness. The standard Storm Bolter and Power Fist combination was often replaced with twin lightning claws or specialized assault weapons that maximized the wearer's ability to engage multiple enemies simultaneously. The armor's targeting systems were calibrated for close-range combat, with enhanced motion sensors and threat identification protocols that helped warriors track enemies in the confused melee of hand-to-hand fighting. The psychological impact of Terminator armored flesh terrors was considerable, as their imposing presence and savage reputation often caused enemies to flee rather than face them in direct combat. The chapter's vehicle modifications reflected their tactical doctrine's emphasis on rapid deployment and shock assault operations. Rhino transports were equipped with additional armor plating and ramming spikes that allowed them to function as improvised assault vehicles, while their passenger compartments were modified to accommodate the specialized equipment required for close combat operations. The vehicle's engines were enhanced to provide greater speed and acceleration, allowing them to deliver assault troops to their targets with maximum impact. Many Rhinos also featured external weapon mounts that could be operated by passengers, providing fire support during the critical moments before troops disembarked for close combat. Land Raiders represented the chapter's most prized armored assets, with each vehicle extensively modified to serve as both transport and assault platform. The standard lascannon armament was often supplemented with additional close-range weapons, including heavy flamers and assault cannons that could clear enemy positions before the embarked troops engaged in melee combat. The vehicle's assault ramps were reinforced and equipped with additional sensors that allowed for more precise deployment of troops in contested areas. The psychological impact of Land Raiders bearing the Flesh Terror's colors and trophies was significant, as their appearance on the battlefield often signaled the beginning of particularly brutal engagements. The chapter's aircraft reflected their need for rapid deployment and the ability to deliver assault troops directly into combat zones. Thunderhawks were modified with additional armor and close-range weapons that could provide fire support during troop insertion operations. The aircraft's passenger compartments were configured to accommodate the specialized equipment required for assault operations, while their loading ramps were reinforced to allow for rapid deployment under fire. The chapter's pilots were trained in aggressive insertion techniques that minimized exposure time while maximizing the shock value of their arrival. The chapter's fleet assets had evolved to support their preference for rapid deployment and shock assault operations across multiple theater of operations. The strike cruisers that formed the backbone of their naval forces were extensively modified with enhanced engines and reinforced boarding equipment that allowed them to engage enemy vessels in close-quarters combat. The ship's weapon systems were calibrated for close-range engagements, with additional torpedo tubes and boarding torpedoes that could deliver assault troops directly onto enemy vessels. The psychological impact of facing flesh terrors in the confined spaces of a starship was considerable, as their savage reputation and close combat expertise made them devastatingly effective in boarding actions. The chapter's battle barges represented their most significant naval assets, serving as mobile fortresses that could support extended campaigns while providing the heavy firepower necessary for planetary assault operations. These ancient vessels bore the scars of countless battles, their hulls decorated with the trophies and battle honors accumulated over millennia of warfare. The ship's launch bays were configured to support rapid deployment operations, with specialized equipment for maintaining and deploying the chapter's assault craft and drop pods. The vessel's command centers were equipped with advanced tactical systems that allowed for the coordination of complex multi-vector assaults. The chapter's approach to managing Death Company Marines required specialized equipment designed to contain and direct their psychotic fury while maximizing their combat effectiveness. The armor worn by these afflicted warriors was extensively modified with additional restraint systems and monitoring equipment that allowed chaplains to track their condition and intervene when necessary. The weapons assigned to Death Company Marines were simplified and reinforced to function reliably even when operated by individuals whose rational faculties had been compromised by their visions. These modifications often included larger grips, simplified controls, and redundant systems that could continue functioning even after sustaining significant damage. The containment facilities within the chapter's fortress monastery represented some of their most specialized equipment, designed to house Death Company Marines who had survived their supposedly final battles. These chambers were constructed using the strongest materials available, with reinforced walls and restraint systems that could hold even the most violent individuals without causing permanent injury. The facilities were equipped with monitoring systems that allowed the chapter's chaplains and apothecaries to observe the afflicted warriors and attempt various treatment protocols. The chambers were designed to be both secure and humane, acknowledging the tragic nature of the warrior's condition while ensuring the safety of the chapter's other personnel. The chapter's medical facilities reflected their unique requirements for treating warriors afflicted with genetic conditions that affected both their physical and psychological well-being. The apothecarian was equipped with specialized diagnostic equipment that could monitor the progression of the Red Thirst and identify the early signs of the Black Rage. The facilities included isolation chambers where affected warriors could be safely contained during treatment, along with surgical suites equipped with the advanced equipment necessary for genetic therapy and psychological intervention. The chapter's apothecaries had developed specialized techniques for managing their genetic heritage, including experimental treatments that showed promise for slowing the progression of their conditions. The chapter's approach to weapon consecration and maintenance reflected their understanding that their equipment served both practical and spiritual purposes. The fortress monastery's armory included specialized chambers where weapons could be blessed using rituals that incorporated elements from both imperial tradition and Cretacean tribal customs. These ceremonies were conducted by the chapter's chaplains in cooperation with their tech marines, ensuring that the spiritual aspects of the process did not interfere with the weapon's mechanical function. The consecration process included the application of sacred oils mixed with the blood of fallen enemies, creating weapons that were both spiritually potent and psychologically satisfying for warriors struggling with the Red Thirst. The chapter's training facilities were designed to accommodate their unique combat doctrine while providing safe environments for warriors to practice their techniques without risking injury to their battle brothers. The fortress monastery included specialized combat chambers that could simulate various battlefield conditions, from the dense jungles of Cretaceous to the confined spaces of enemy starships. These facilities were equipped with advanced holographic systems that could create realistic enemy targets, while their floors and walls were reinforced to withstand the impact of powered weapons and superhuman strength. The training areas also included medical stations staffed by the chapter's apothecaries, who could provide immediate treatment for any injuries sustained during practice sessions. The chapter's reliquary contained some of the most sacred artifacts in their possession, including weapons and equipment that had belonged to their founding members and other heroes of the chapter's history. These relics were maintained in specially constructed chambers that provided optimal preservation conditions while allowing for their ceremonial display during important chapter events. The artifacts included the personal weapons of Chapter Master Nasir Amit, along with various trophies and battle honors that had been accumulated over the chapter's long history. The reliquary served both as a repository for important historical artifacts and as a source of inspiration for current members of the chapter. The chapter's approach to equipment distribution reflected their understanding that different warriors required different tools based on their individual circumstances and the severity of their genetic conditions. Warriors who showed signs of succumbing to the Red Thirst were often equipped with specialized weapons that could provide the psychological satisfaction they needed while maintaining their combat effectiveness. These assignments were made by the chapter's chaplains in consultation with the Tech Marines, ensuring that each warrior received equipment that suited both their tactical role and their personal needs. The distribution process included regular evaluations to ensure that equipment assignments remained appropriate as warriors' conditions evolved over time. The genetic degradation afflicting the flesh terrors had accelerated dramatically in recent centuries, transforming what had once been a manageable curse into an existential threat that jeopardized the chapter's very survival. The Red Thirst now manifested in neophytes within months of their gene seed implantation, rather than the years or decades that had characterized earlier generations. The chapter's apothecaries documented cases where aspirants succumbed to violent episodes during the transformation process itself, their bodies rejecting the gene seed modifications, while their minds fractured under the psychological strain of their genetic inheritance. The Black Rage claimed veterans at an unprecedented rate, with seasoned battle brothers who had served for decades suddenly falling to visions of Sanguinius's final battle. The chapter's death company had grown from a small, tragic minority to represent nearly 15% of their total strength, creating logistical nightmares for commanders who struggled to deploy these psychotic warriors effectively while maintaining operational security. The fortress monastery's containment facilities had been expanded 3 times in the past century, yet they remained overcrowded with Death Company Marines who had survived their supposedly final battles. Gabriel Seth's reforms had begun with a comprehensive analysis of the chapter's recruitment practices, identifying specific genetic markers within Cretaceous population that seemed to correlate with resistance to the Red Thirst. The chapter master ordered his apothecaries to conduct extensive genetic surveys of the planet's tribal populations, seeking bloodlines that might produce more stable recruits. These investigations revealed disturbing patterns of genetic drift within the human population, suggesting that centuries of exposure to the chapter's corrupted gene seed had created subtle mutations that were now manifesting in the general population. The chapter's recruitment standards had necessarily become more stringent, with potential candidates undergoing months of psychological evaluation before being deemed suitable for transformation. The selection process now included exposure to controlled doses of synthetic compounds that mimicked the effects of the Red Thirst, allowing the chapter's specialists to identify individuals who possessed the mental fortitude necessary to resist their genetic heritage. These enhanced screening procedures had reduced the recruitment rate to less than half of previous levels, creating a critical shortage of new battle brothers that threatened to leave the chapter unable to replace its losses. Seth's attempts to address the chapter's genetic problems had led to controversial partnerships with elements of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who specialized in biological research. The chapter master had authorized the establishment of joint research facilities on remote worlds within the chapter's domain, where teams of apothecaries and tech adepts worked to understand the mechanisms underlying the accelerating genetic degradation. These collaborations required careful management to avoid attracting unwanted attention from imperial authorities who might view such research as heretical deviation from accepted doctrine. The Mechanicus researchers brought advanced analytical equipment and theoretical frameworks that had proven invaluable for understanding the complex genetic interactions that produced the Red Thirst and Black Rage. Their studies had identified specific gene sequences that appeared to be mutating at accelerated rates, creating cascading effects that disrupted normal neurochemical processes. The tech adepts' dispassionate approach to biological research provided perspectives that the chapter's own specialists had been unable to achieve, as their emotional investment in their genetic heritage had sometimes clouded their scientific judgment. The joint research programs had yielded several promising avenues for potential treatment, including viral vectors designed to repair damaged gene sequences and synthetic compounds that could suppress the expression of corrupted genetic material. These experimental treatments had shown limited success in laboratory conditions, but their application to living subjects remained problematic due to the complex interactions between space marine physiology and the various enhancement processes that had been applied over the centuries. The researchers had documented cases where attempted treatments had actually accelerated the onset of genetic conditions, creating ethical dilemmas about the risks of continued experimentation. The chapter's reduced numbers had forced significant changes in their operational doctrine, as they could no longer sustain the heavy casualties that had characterized their previous campaigns. Seth had implemented new tactical protocols that emphasized precision strikes and rapid extraction, minimizing exposure to prolonged combat that might trigger red thirst episodes among his warriors. These modifications required extensive retraining of veteran battle brothers who had spent decades perfecting aggressive assault techniques, creating resistance within the chapter's ranks from warriors who viewed the changes as betrayals of their martial heritage. The chapter's deployment patterns had shifted towards smaller, more specialized operations that could be accomplished with limited manpower while still achieving strategic objectives. Rather than committing entire companies to major campaigns, the Flesh Terrors now operated in reinforced squad formations that could be rapidly deployed to crisis points throughout their operational area. These smaller units required enhanced coordination and communication systems, as individual squad leaders now bore responsibilities that had previously been reserved for company commanders. The psychological impact of the chapter's declining numbers had created morale problems that threatened to undermine Seth's reform efforts. Battle brothers who had once taken pride in their chapter's reputation for overwhelming force now found themselves fighting defensive actions and conducting strategic withdrawals that felt like defeats. The chapter's chaplains worked tirelessly to maintain unit cohesion and fighting spirit, emphasizing the honor inherent in their struggle against impossible odds while seeking to preserve their genetic heritage for future generations. The chapter's relationship with other imperial forces had grown increasingly strained as their reputation for reliability declined. Imperial commanders who had once eagerly requested Flesh Terror's support now hesitated to deploy them in sensitive operations, fearing that their genetic instability might create diplomatic complications or tactical disasters. The chapter found itself relegated to increasingly marginal roles, conducting operations that other forces were unwilling or unable to undertake, but which offered little opportunity for the decisive victories that had once defined their identity. Seth's efforts to rehabilitate the chapter's reputation had met with mixed success, as each operational deployment carried the risk of incidents that could further damage their standing within the imperial hierarchy. The chapter master had implemented strict behavioral protocols and enhanced oversight procedures, assigning chaplains to monitor individual squads during combat operations and intervene when necessary to prevent excessive violence. These measures had reduced the frequency of disciplinary incidents, but had also created tension within the chapter's ranks, as warriors felt their judgment and honor were being questioned by their own leadership. The chapter's medical facilities had been extensively expanded and upgraded to accommodate their growing population of genetically afflicted warriors. The fortress monastery now contained entire wings dedicated to housing and treating battle brothers who suffered from various manifestations of their genetic curse, from mild red thirst symptoms to complete black rage psychosis. The chapter's apothecaries had developed specialized treatment protocols for each condition, though their success rates remained disappointingly low despite decades of research and experimentation. The management of Death Company Marines had become one of the chapter's most pressing challenges, as their numbers continued to grow while their tactical utility remained limited. Seth had authorized the construction of additional containment facilities and the development of new deployment strategies that could utilize these psychotic warriors more effectively. The chapter's chaplains had experimented with various psychological conditioning techniques, seeking ways to direct the afflicted warrior's aggression towards specific targets while minimizing the risk to friendly forces. The chapter's gene seed stocks had become critically depleted, with many samples showing signs of corruption that rendered them unsuitable for creating new space marines. The apothecaries had implemented strict quality control measures, subjecting each batch of gene seed to extensive testing before authorizing its use in recruitment operations. These procedures had identified numerous cases of genetic degradation that would have previously gone undetected, but they had also reduced the available supply of viable genetic material to dangerously low levels. The search for alternative sources of gene seed had led to controversial negotiations with other Blood Angels' successor chapters, as the Flesh Terrors sought to acquire samples that might be less corrupted than their own stocks. These discussions had proven difficult due to the other chapters' reluctance to share their precious genetic heritage with a chapter whose reputation for instability made them poor candidates for such cooperation. The political implications of these negotiations had required careful management to avoid creating diplomatic incidents that might further isolate the chapter from their cousins. The chapter's technological capabilities had been enhanced through their partnership with the Adeptus Mechanicus, as the tech adepts had provided access to advanced diagnostic equipment and manufacturing capabilities that exceeded the chapter's previous resources. These improvements had enabled more sophisticated analysis of their genetic problems, while also supporting the development of specialized equipment designed to manage their unique operational requirements. The collaboration had required significant concessions from the chapter, including the sharing of sensitive genetic data and the acceptance of Mechanicus oversight of certain research programs. The political challenges facing the chapter had grown more complex as their reputation for reliability declined, and their genetic problems became more widely known within imperial circles. Seth had been forced to devote increasing amounts of time to diplomatic efforts, seeking to maintain the chapter's standing within the imperial hierarchy while addressing concerns about their operational effectiveness. These political pressures had created additional stress for a chapter already struggling with existential threats to their survival. The chapter's future prospects remained uncertain despite the various reform efforts and research programs that had been implemented under Seth's leadership. The accelerating rate of genetic degradation suggested that the chapter might have only a few centuries remaining before their gene seed became completely unusable, effectively ending their existence as a space marine chapter. The research partnerships with the Mechanicus offered hope for potential solutions, but the complexity of the genetic problems involved meant that any breakthrough would likely require decades of additional work. The recruitment challenges facing the chapter had forced them to consider previously unthinkable options, including the possibility of relocating to a different homeworld with a population that might be more genetically compatible with their needs. Such a move would require abandoning centuries of tradition and cultural development on Cretaceous, creating psychological trauma that might prove as damaging as their genetic problems. The chapter's leadership continued to explore this option while hoping that alternative solutions might be found. The chapter's combat effectiveness had been maintained through careful resource management and tactical adaptation, but the underlying problems continued to worsen despite all efforts to address them. The constant struggle against their genetic heritage had created a siege mentality within the chapter, as battle brothers focused on immediate survival rather than long-term strategic planning. This psychological state had both advantages and disadvantages, providing motivation for desperate courage while potentially limiting the chapter's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The ongoing research efforts had revealed additional complications within the chapter's genetic heritage, including previously unknown interactions between different aspects of their gene seed that created cascading effects throughout their physiological systems. These discoveries had opened new avenues for potential treatment while also demonstrating the complexity of the problems they faced. The chapter's specialists had begun to understand that their genetic curse was not a single condition, but rather a constellation of related disorders that required comprehensive treatment approaches. The chapter's relationship with their parent legion had evolved as the Blood Angels, and their other successors grappled with their own genetic challenges while observing the flesh terror's more severe manifestations. The sharing of research data and treatment protocols had created unprecedented levels of cooperation between the various chapters, though the flesh terror's extreme condition continued to set them apart from their cousins. The knowledge gained from studying their genetic degradation had proven valuable for understanding the broader implications of the curse that affected all of Sanguinius's sons. The flesh terror's reputation throughout the Imperium had become a double-edged sword that simultaneously opened doors to certain types of operations while closing others entirely. Imperial commanders who understood the chapter's capabilities would specifically request their assistance for missions requiring the complete elimination of enemy forces without regard for collateral damage or prisoner taking. The chapter's effectiveness in these scenarios had earned them grudging respect from military leaders who appreciated results over methods, particularly in situations where conventional forces had failed or where the political consequences of failure outweighed concerns about excessive violence. The Astra Militarum's relationship with the flesh terrors reflected the complex dynamics that characterized their interactions with other imperial organizations. Guard commanders who had witnessed the chapter's effectiveness in combat often praised their ability to achieve decisive results in seemingly impossible situations. The 47th Cadian Shock Regiment's After Action reports from the Third War for Armageddon specifically noted how a single company of flesh terrors had broken through Orc defensive lines that had held against 3 full Guard regiments for over a month. The psychological impact of the Space Marines' arrival had been as important as their physical capabilities, as enemy forces often fled rather than face warriors whose reputation for savagery preceded them. However, the same reports also documented incidents where the chapter's methods had created complications for subsequent operations. The aftermath of flesh terror's engagements typically required extensive cleanup operations to remove the mutilated remains of enemy forces, while the psychological trauma inflicted on Imperial Guard units who witnessed their methods sometimes required medical intervention. Colonel Voss of the 23rd Mordian Iron Guard had submitted formal complaints about the chapter's conduct during joint operations, citing specific instances where their excessive violence had made it impossible to gather intelligence from captured enemies or maintain the discipline necessary for effective military operations. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintained a complex relationship with the flesh terrors that reflected both scientific interest and theological concern. The tech priests found the chapter's genetic degradation fascinating from a research perspective, as their extreme manifestations of the red thirst and black rage provided unique insights into the mechanisms underlying these conditions. The Magos Biologist Zerath had established a permanent research station within the chapters domain specifically to study their genetic heritage, contributing advanced analytical equipment and theoretical frameworks that had proven invaluable for understanding their condition. The theological implications of the chapter's genetic curse had created debates within Mechanicus circles about the nature of the Omnissiah's design and the acceptable limits of biological modification. Some tech priests viewed the flesh terror's condition as evidence of the Emperor's fallibility, while others interpreted it as a test of faith that required technological solutions. The chapter's willingness to participate in experimental treatments and genetic research had made them valuable partners for Mechanicus researchers, though the secrecy surrounding these collaborations had occasionally created tensions with other imperial organizations. The ecclesiarchy's relationship with the flesh terrors had evolved over the millennia as the chapter's reputation for excessive violence clashed with official imperial doctrine regarding the treatment of civilian populations. Cardinal Vex of the Segmentum Solar had issued several formal censures regarding the chapter's conduct during compliance operations, citing specific instances where their methods had violated established protocols for dealing with human populations. The Church's concerns focused not on the chapter's loyalty to the Emperor, but on their interpretation of what constituted acceptable service to the imperial cause. The chapter's own chaplains had worked to address these concerns through the development of modified deployment protocols that emphasized discrimination between legitimate military targets and non-combatants. These efforts had met with limited success, as the genetic urges that drove their warriors often made such distinctions impossible to maintain during the heat of combat. The chaplains' reports to ecclesiarchy authorities had documented their ongoing struggles to balance their warriors' effectiveness with the moral requirements of imperial service, creating a complex dialogue about the nature of duty and acceptable sacrifice. The Inquisition's interest in the flesh terrors had intensified as their genetic problems worsened and their behavior became more unpredictable. Several inquisitors had established monitoring protocols to track the chapter's activities and assess the potential threat they might pose to imperial security. Inquisitor Malthorn of the Ordo Hereticus had conducted a comprehensive investigation into the chapter's practices, examining their recruitment methods, combat doctrine, and genetic research programs for signs of heretical deviation or chaos corruption. The investigation had revealed no evidence of deliberate heresy or chaos influence, but it had documented concerning patterns of behavior that suggested the chapter's genetic curse might be worsening beyond their ability to control. The Inquisitor's report had recommended continued monitoring while acknowledging the chapter's value as a military asset, creating a delicate balance between security concerns and operational necessity. The chapter's leadership had cooperated fully with the investigation, recognizing that their survival depended on maintaining the trust of imperial authorities despite their genetic problems. The chapter's role in the broader defense of imperial space had evolved to focus on specific types of threats that matched their capabilities, while minimizing the risks associated with their genetic instability. The Flesh Terrors had become specialists in rapid response operations against Xenos incursions, particularly those involving species that required complete elimination rather than negotiation or containment. Their deployment against Tyrannid splinter fleets had proven particularly effective, as the aliens' complete lack of fear made them ideal opponents for warriors whose genetic heritage demanded violent close combat. The chapter's participation in the defense of the Cadian Gate during the 13th Black Crusade had demonstrated their continued value as a military asset despite their declining numbers and genetic problems. The Flesh Terrors had deployed their entire chapter strength to assist in holding the crucial defensive line that protected the Imperium's heartland from chaos incursion. Their performance during the campaign had earned recognition from the highest levels of Imperial command, with Lord Castellan Creed specifically noting their effectiveness in breaking through chaos defensive positions that had stalled other Imperial forces. The psychological impact of the chapter's presence on both allies and enemies had become one of their most significant contributions to Imperial military operations. Enemy forces that might have fought stubbornly against conventional Space Marine chapters often broke and fled when faced with the Flesh Terror's reputation for savage violence. This psychological warfare effect had proven particularly valuable in operations where time was critical and prolonged sieges were not feasible, allowing Imperial forces to achieve strategic objectives through intimidation rather than extended combat. The chapter's allies had learned to appreciate their effectiveness while maintaining careful distance from their methods. The Blood Angels and their other successor chapters had developed protocols for joint operations that maximized the Flesh Terror's combat effectiveness while minimizing exposure to their more disturbing practices. These arrangements had required delicate negotiations and careful planning, but they had enabled successful cooperation in situations where the combined strength of multiple chapters was necessary for victory. The fear and respect that the Flesh Terrors inspired among their enemies had become legendary throughout the galaxy. Orc warbosses who had faced them in combat would warn their followers about the blood-mad Hummies who fought with supernatural fury and showed no mercy to defeated enemies. Chaos cultists told stories of Space Marines who drank the blood of their victims, and decorated their armor with the bones of the fallen, creating myths that often exceeded the reality of the chapter's practices, but served to amplify their psychological impact. The chapter's reputation had also influenced their recruitment patterns, as the tribal populations of Cretaceous had developed cultural practices that reflected their understanding of what was required to serve alongside the Space Marines. Young warriors who aspired to join the chapter would undergo voluntary scarification and blood rituals that mimicked the practices they observed among their genetic betters, creating a feedback loop that reinforced the chapter's savage culture while providing a steady supply of psychologically prepared recruits. The chapter's place in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium represented both the potential for heroic sacrifice and the tragic consequences of genetic corruption. Their ongoing struggle against extinction had become a microcosm of the broader challenges facing the Imperium, as they fought to preserve their identity and purpose while adapting to circumstances that threatened their very existence. The Flesh Terrors embodied the fundamental tension between the nobility of the Space Marine ideal and the harsh realities of survival, in a galaxy where compromise and adaptation were often the only alternatives to annihilation. The chapter's contributions to major Imperial campaigns had earned them a place in the annals of military history, despite the controversial nature of their methods. Their participation in the Badab War had demonstrated their unwavering loyalty to Imperial authority, even when required to fight against fellow Space Marines. The chapter's performance during the Third War for Armageddon had showcased their ability to function as part of larger military coalitions, while maintaining their distinctive combat effectiveness. Their ongoing service in the defense of the Cadian Gate had proven their continued value as a military asset despite their genetic problems. The legacy of the Flesh Terrors would ultimately be defined by their struggle to balance the competing demands of their genetic heritage and their duty to the Emperor. Their willingness to embrace their savage nature, while seeking to control its worst excesses, had created a unique chapter culture that served as both inspiration and warning for other Imperial forces. The chapter's ongoing research into their genetic problems had contributed valuable knowledge to the broader understanding of Space Marine biology and the challenges facing all of Sanguinius's sons. The future of the Flesh Terrors remained uncertain as they faced the dual challenges of genetic degradation and declining numbers. Their survival would depend on their ability to find solutions to their genetic problems while maintaining the combat effectiveness that justified their continued existence. The chapter's leadership had demonstrated remarkable adaptability in addressing these challenges, implementing reforms and research programs that offered hope for long-term survival while preserving the essential characteristics that define their identity. The Flesh Terrors story represented one of the most complex and tragic chapters in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. Their struggle against their genetic curse had created a warrior culture that was simultaneously noble and savage, disciplined and chaotic, loyal and dangerous. Their legacy would be remembered not just for their military achievements, but for their embodiment of the fundamental contradictions that defined existence in the 41st millennium, where survival often required embracing the very darkness that threatened to consume the human spirit. As the galaxy burned around them and the forces of chaos pressed ever closer to the Imperium's heartland, the Flesh Terrors continued their eternal vigil. They stood as guardians against the darkness, their chainswords screaming defiance against the dying of the light, their blood-stained armor a testament to their unwavering dedication to the Emperor's cause. Whether they would ultimately triumph over their genetic curse or fall to the same darkness that had claimed so many of their brothers remained to be seen, but their struggle itself had become a symbol of the Imperium's refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. The chapter's final legacy would be written in the blood of their enemies and the sacrifice of their warriors, a crimson testament to the price of survival in a universe where only the strong endured and the weak were consumed by the eternal war that defined existence in the grim darkness of the far future.